Chapter 1. The Horrible Life of Pirates, You Wouldn't Survive. Hey guys. Tonight we're drifting out to sea. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle into whatever vaguely comfortable position you've invented for sleep, and just let the waves of questionable life choices wash over you. Because tonight we're talking about pirates. And not the Jack Sparrow kind, or the ones with that Disney glow. No, these are the real ones. The ones who didn't smell like rum and charm, but like brine, rotting wood, and regret. The ones whose freedom on the open sea mostly meant constant diarrhea and skin infections. So let's set sail. Slowly, because we've got a few centuries of disease and delusion to drift through. The myth of the romantic pirate. The popular image of a pirate, cocky grin, shining cutlass, a parrot on the shoulder, is, of course, an absolute fantasy. Pirates weren't mysterious rebels. They were unemployed sailors with trust issues and vitamin deficiencies. The golden age of piracy, roughly between 1650 and 1730, wasn't really golden either. It was more damp and itchy. England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands were all running around colonizing whatever wasn't nailed down. And with all that shipping traffic, there were bound to be sailors who thought, why work for wages when we could just steal everything? Of course, most of them didn't live long enough to regret that thought. Life expectancy for your average pirate? 2 years if you were lucky. And that's assuming you didn't die of scurvy, get executed, or accidentally fall off the ship during a brawl over someone else's moldy biscuit. Still, piracy was strangely democratic. Crew members often voted on their captains, which sounds very progressive until you realize the ballot was usually a knife. The smell of freedom and decay. Let's start with the basics, the smell. Because yes, it's hard to imagine while lying in your lavender-scented bed, but a pirate ship was essentially a floating dumpster. Hygiene? Non-existent. Baths? Absolutely not. The best you could hope for was a quick rinse in seawater, which left your skin tight and salty like jerky. Laundry was a luxury no one had time for, and lice were just roommates. Their clothes? Usually stolen, unwashed, and layered for warmth, not style. If you were particularly unlucky, you might inherit a dead man's boots and the foot fungus that came with them. The air below deck was thick with a stew of smells. Damp wood, sweat, gunpowder, spoiled rations, and the subtle tang of despair. Even sleeping arrangements were dreadful. Hammocks jammed shoulder to shoulder, with the occasional rat joining in. If the sea was rough, you'd wake up swinging like a miserable pendulum, possibly with someone's elbow in your face. Romantic? Hardly. But it beats drowning. Barely. Food, the real horror. You might think the worst thing about piracy was the risk of death. Actually, it was the food. Pirate cuisine was, let's say, adventurous. Ships were stocked with salted meat, hardtack biscuits, and whatever dried beans or peas could survive months at sea. By week 3, everything tasted like rotten salt. Hardtack was the favorite, a lovely, rock-like biscuit that could double as a weapon. You had to soak it in water, rum, or soup to make it chewable, and even then, you risked breaking a tooth. And you would break teeth. Pirates had famously awful dental health. Some didn't have enough teeth left to chew at all. Then there was the meat, salted so heavily it was basically cured despair. Maggots? Normal. Worms? Also normal. The trick was to eat it in low light so you didn't see the movement. Fresh fruit or vegetables were rare, so scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency that made your gums rot and your skin bruise like a peach, was rampant. Some pirates' teeth fell out entirely, which made threatening merchants a bit less intimidating. And the water? Don't even ask. Stored in wooden barrels, it went green with algae after a few weeks. Most pirates just mixed it with rum to kill the taste. Which worked, sort of. But it also meant everyone was constantly drunk. Which explains a lot, actually. Medicine? Just cut it off. If you happened to get sick or injured, which you would, the medical care was about as comforting as a chainsaw in a candle shop. Ships sometimes carried a surgeon, but that title didn't mean much. A ship's surgeon was usually a failed barber with a saw. His toolkit? Rusty knives, a bottle of rum, and prayer. Infections spread fast, and antibiotics didn't exist. A splinter could turn fatal. A bullet wound meant amputation, performed without anesthesia. If you screamed, "Congratulations," it meant you were still alive. Of course, pirates were surprisingly pragmatic about it. Lose a limb? You might get a promotion to gunner or cook. Hooks and wooden legs weren't fashion statements, they were survival gear. That famous eye patch trope? Often real, but not because of battles. It was to cover infected or sunburned eyes. Pirates worked under blinding light, surrounded by reflective water all day. Snow blindness, but with salt. By your mid-20s, you looked 50. By 30, you were ancient. The reality of freedom. Now, to be fair, piracy wasn't all misery. Some joined willingly, seeking escape from cruel Navy discipline or poverty. The Royal Navy was infamous for its brutal conditions, worse in some ways than piracy. On a Navy ship, flogging was a daily routine. Wages were terrible, and desertion could get you hanged. So when pirates offered a life where you got a fair share of the loot and could vote on your captain, it actually sounded good. Pirate ships ran on Articles of Agreement, little proto-constitutions. They outlined everything from how to divide treasure to what counted as acceptable behavior. Stealing from your crewmates? Punishable by death. Cheating at dice? Whipping. Bringing a woman aboard? Usually forbidden, since it caused fights. Democracy on the high seas, but with more scurvy. Famous and miserable faces. Let's drift through a few of the more famous pirates. You'll notice a theme. Everyone's life ended badly. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. The legend says he tied slow-burning fuses into his beard before battle, so smoke would curl around his face like a demon. Terrifying, sure, but also probably smelled awful. He commanded fear, not just from enemies, but from his own men. Yet despite his reputation, there's no solid record of him killing anyone personally. He mostly relied on theatrics. Present? Bloody mess. In 1718, he was cornered by the Royal Navy off North Carolina. After a fierce fight, he was shot and stabbed multiple times, then beheaded. His head was hung from the ship's bow like a grotesque hood ornament. The moral? Don't get too into your brand. Then there was Charles Vane, the hothead. Brilliant at piracy, terrible at teamwork. He got voted out by his own crew, Democracy Strikes Again, and was eventually captured and hanged in Jamaica. Calico Jack Rackham was more famous for his wardrobe than his piracy. He was stylish, yes, but incompetent. His greatest claim to fame? Sailing with 2 female pirates, and Bonnie and Mary Red. Both women disguised themselves as men to join the crew, because, of course, women weren't allowed on ships. They fought fiercely. When the ship was finally captured, legend says, and told Jack in his cell, "If you'd fought like a man, you needn't be hanged like a dog." Harsh bedtime story energy. The daily routine of misery. What did a pirate actually do all day? Aside from being drunk and itchy, surprisingly little. When not raiding, they cleaned weapons, patched sails, and argued about rations. Ship life was endless maintenance. You didn't just float around waiting for treasure maps. You repaired ropes, caulked decks, and chased rats. During long lulls, boredom was the real killer. Pirates gambled, sang, and told wild lies about adventures they definitely didn't have. And when a prize ship did appear on the horizon, everything went chaotic. Cannon smoke, shouts, splinters, blood, and if you won, a brief high followed by endless squabbling over loot. Gold was rare. Most treasures were barrels of sugar, tobacco, or cloth. And once it was sold, the money vanished in a single week of shore leave. Brothels, rum, and bad decisions. Then it was back to sea. The cycle repeated until death, capture, or one final binge ended it all. Justice and the gallows. Let's float now to the final chapter of most pirate careers, execution. When pirates were caught, they weren't given dramatic trials. Just quick, efficient hangings. The British Navy loved public spectacles. Bodies were left dangling as a warning, or tarred and displayed in cages, which really killed the vibe at the harbor. Pirates often took it with dark humor. Some gave speeches before dying, boasting about their adventures. Others joked to the crowd. One pirate, before being hanged, supposedly said, Well, this is a fine necktie for a gentleman. There's a certain peace in that fatalism. They lived rough, died rough, and accepted it. But the myth lived on, romanticized, polished by storytellers who left out the lice and dysentery. The quiet truth. In the end, piracy was just another desperate job in a brutal world. A life of freedom that usually ended in disease or the noose. But it's oddly human, that longing for liberty, even when it comes wrapped in misery. So next time someone talks about wanting to live like a pirate, maybe picture the toothless, half-starved man swinging in a hammock eating maggoty bread by lantern light. He's technically free, but only because no one else wants his job. Let's drift away from this miserable crew for now, and in the next chapter, we'll wade deeper into the dark reality of the pirate world. The women, the codes, the betrayals, and the diseases that could wipe out a whole ship faster than cannon fire. Chapter 2: Women and Power on the High Seas. For all the salty legends about pirates, women rarely make the cut. That's not because they weren't there, it's just that most historians, being men in powdered wigs, didn't take kindly to writing about women who carried pistols and swore like sailors. But they existed, and they were often far more terrifying than their male counterparts. The sea, after all, was one of the few places a woman could truly vanish from the rules of polite society, assuming she didn't mind losing her name, her reputation, and probably a few teeth along the way. So, let's talk about them. The women who put on breeches, tied up their hair, and said, "Fine, I'll just be a man then." Dressing for survival. To survive aboard a pirate ship, a woman had to erase herself. No dresses, no long hair, no polite smiles. A few cloth bindings, a loose shirt, and an attitude problem were your new uniform. It wasn't just to blend in, it was for survival. Pirate crews were not known for their restraint. A woman discovered among them was at serious risk, unless she proved, swiftly and violently, that she was not to be trifled with. So the disguise wasn't just practical. It was armor. And Bonnie and Mary Red are the poster children for this brand of chaos. But they weren't the only ones, they're just the only ones who got caught and talked about before being hanged. And Bonnie, the fiery Irish stowaway. And Bonnie was born in Ireland around 1697, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his servant. That's already a complicated start. Her father moved the family to South Carolina to escape scandal, where and promptly grew up to be a red-haired problem. By her teens, she had a temper that could curdle milk. She reportedly stabbed a servant girl just for annoying her. Charming. Then she married a small-time sailor named James Bonny, who, depending on which account you believe, was either hopelessly dull or hopelessly broke. Either way, Anne's father disowned her, and she ended up in the pirate haven of Nassau in the Bahamas. Nassau at that time was basically the Vegas of piracy, sweaty, lawless, and full of rum. There she met Calico Jack Rackham, a man whose only remarkable trait was that he dressed like a carnival flag. She fell for him instantly, because of course she did. The two ran off together, and disguised herself as a man to join his crew. She soon made it very clear that she wasn't just there for decoration. Eyewitnesses said she fought, as well as any man on board. Which, considering most men on board were half drunk and half starved, might not sound impressive, but still, points for effort. Mary Red, the reluctant rebel. Mary Reed's life started off as a trick. Her mother dressed her as a boy to claim inheritance money after her brother's death. And so Mary grew up as Mark, living an accidental life for survival. By her teens, she was working on ships and later joined the British Army, still disguised as a man. She even fell in love with a fellow soldier, revealed her identity, and married him. They opened an inn together, but, this being the 18th century, he promptly died. So Mary put the breeches back on and went to sea. She joined a Dutch ship, which was promptly captured by pirates. She decided, pragmatically, to just switch sides. That's how she met Anne Bonny, both disguised as men, both fighting under Calico Jack. When they realized each other's secret, they reportedly became close. Some said romantically close, but honestly, when you're living in a lice-infested wooden coffin with 40 men, emotional connection of any kind probably feels like romance. Their careers didn't last long. In 1720, Their ship was attacked off Jamaica by a government vessel. Most of the crew were too drunk to fight. Anne and Mary, however, refused to go quietly. They stood their ground, firing pistols and swinging cutlasses until they were overpowered. When the smoke cleared, Calico Jack was found hiding below deck, possibly under a table, while his 2 female crewmates were still standing. At their trial, both women pleaded the belly, claiming they were pregnant, which delayed their execution. Mary died of fever in prison soon after. Anne's fate is murky. Some say her father paid for her release. Others say she vanished into obscurity. Either way, she never saw Jack again. Before his hanging, she reportedly told him, "I'm sorry to see you here, but if you'd fought like a man, you needn't be hanged like a dog." An excellent parting line, if somewhat harsh for a goodbye. Pirate queens, the forgotten rulers. Now, if Anne and Mary were the wild card duo of the Caribbean, the most successful pirate of all time, by far, was a woman. Her name was Jing Isa, better known as Ching Shi. And she made every European pirate look like a confused amateur. Born around 1775 in China, she started as a prostitute in Canton. She was married, or more likely, strategically paired, with a pirate commander, He. When he died, she simply took over his entire fleet. Ching Shi commanded over 300 ships and 20,000 to 40,000 pirates. That's an army. A floating city of chaos. And she ran it with bureaucratic precision. She issued a pirate code, which read more like a corporate handbook than a rebellion charter. Disobedience was punished by death. Rape was punishable by decapitation. Loot had to be properly distributed according to rank. If you think that sounds strict, yes. She turned piracy into a functional government. The Chinese Navy, Portuguese Navy, and even the British East India Company tried to defeat her. They failed. Eventually, she negotiated a full pardon from the Qing government, kept her loot, retired peacefully, and ran a gambling house. She's one of the only pirates in history to die of old age, which feels almost unfair. Women behind the scenes. Of course, not every woman who dealt with pirates was out at sea. Many worked quietly, or not so quietly, on land. Wives and lovers ran smuggling networks, hid loot, or bribed officials. In pirate towns like Port Royal or Nassau, women often controlled taverns, which were the nerve centers of pirate gossip and deals. Some made small fortunes selling supplies or information. Others simply tolerated their pirate partners for the occasional gold coin. And then there were the courtesans, the unofficial diplomats of the pirate world. They brokered introductions, soothed tempers, and knew everyone's secrets. Their role was unofficial but vital. The pirate world, for all its brutality, couldn't function without women, even if history barely remembered their names. Gender, disguise, and power. There's something fascinating and oddly modern about how gender played out in pirate culture. On one hand, ships were aggressively male spaces. The myth of no women aboard wasn't entirely superstition. It was partly an excuse to avoid jealousy and conflict. But on the other hand, the sea offered anonymity. A person could remake themselves. A woman could become a man. A servant could become a captain. A nobody could become legend. That mutability, that strange, salty form of social freedom, was both liberating and terrifying. For and Bonnie and Mary read, disguise was not just protection. It was a chance to live outside the expectations of a world that offered them nothing. They chose danger over invisibility. And for a few years, they succeeded. It's not exactly a bedtime success story, but it's one of the rare instances where history's chaos gave women a fighting chance, even if it was short-lived and full of splinters. The loneliness of the open sea. Let's not pretend it was glamorous. Even with the occasional victory, pirate life was still hunger, storms, and constant fear. For women, that loneliness was doubled. There was no place to belong, too masculine for society, too suspicious for the crew. Their very survival depended on constant vigilance. They couldn't relax, couldn't trust. A single mistake, a gesture, a word, a laugh too soft, could reveal everything. Imagine months of pretending to be someone else, under the worst conditions imaginable. That's the real story, not the sword fights, but the exhaustion. the endless balancing act between visibility and erasure. And in that sense, women pirates were the purest distillation of piracy itself, always pretending, always running, always at risk of sinking. What they left behind. Anne Mary Ching-shi. They didn't just steal ships. They stole narratives. Every age since has projected something onto them. Rebellion, feminism, danger, desire. But they didn't see themselves as symbols. They were just surviving. And somehow, centuries later, we still remember them. Not for treasure, but for audacity. Because nothing scared the 18th century more than a woman who didn't care what people thought, especially if she had a sword. Let's drift onward, away from the disguises and quiet revolutions, and into the next chapter of pirate misery, the diseases that spread faster than mutiny, and how ships became floating morgues long before they ever found gold. Chapter 3. Death, Disease, and Sea Plagues. If you thought pirates were terrifying because of their swords, wait until you hear about their immune systems. The real killer of the seas wasn't cannon fire. It was biology. Invisible, relentless, and profoundly gross. For every pirate who died in battle, 10 more died coughing, bleeding, or melting away from something you couldn't even see. And to make it worse, most of them didn't even understand what was happening. They blamed the weather, the food, the bad air. Basically, everything except the bacteria crawling over every surface. So let's take a calm little sail through the invisible horrors of pirate medicine. Don't worry, we'll keep it gentle, just slowly rotting from the inside out. Scurvy, the great gums disaster. Let's start with scurvy, the celebrity of sailor diseases. If you've ever wondered what happens when you don't eat fruit for 6 months, here's your answer. Your body slowly collapses like wet parchment. It starts small, fatigue, aches, bleeding gums. Then your teeth loosen. Wounds reopen. Your breath could kill a small mammal. Eventually, your gums swell so much they cover your teeth completely, turning your mouth into a soft red nightmare. And if you're thinking, why didn't they just eat oranges? Well, good question. They couldn't. There weren't any. Fresh fruit and vegetables didn't survive long on ships. The humidity turned everything to mush within days. So pirates, and sailors in general, were left with salted meat, dried peas, and hope. Lime juice, the miracle cure, wouldn't become standard until the late 18th century. Before that, ships were just floating vitamin C experiments with a 100% failure rate. Imagine an entire crew of bleeding, toothless men trying to shout "Ahoy" while their joints disintegrate. That's piracy's real soundtrack. Dysentery, the silent tsunami. Then there was dysentery, also known as the flux, which sounds much gentler than it was. It's caused by drinking contaminated water, which was every barrel of water on a ship. Stored for months, sloshing around with bacteria, algae, and probably a few drowned insects. After a few weeks, it smelled like a swamp. After a few months, it tasted like one. The result? Endless diarrhea. Unstoppable, dehydrating, dignity-destroying diarrhea. Pirates couldn't afford to waste water, so they often stayed dehydrated, delirious, and faint. And since there were no toilets, just a hole in the deck or a rope over the side, well, you can imagine the logistics. One rough wave and you were gone. Death by hygiene attempt. Many sailors were literally too weak to stand, dying quietly in the corner while their shipmates argued over the last piece of moldy bread. But yes, sure, freedom on the high seas. Typhus and the lice problem. Now, let's talk about lice. Because everyone had them. Pirates were rarely able to wash their clothes or hair. Fabric stayed damp for months, breeding grounds for insects. Lice spread from head to head, from shirt to shirt, until the entire ship was a walking petri dish. And lice didn't just itch, they carried typhus. Typhus brought fever, rashes, delirium, and death. In cramped, unventilated ships, it spread faster than gossip in a tavern. Victims raved, shook, and often jumped overboard in feverish confusion. Those who survived were left weak and hallucinating for weeks. Pirates sometimes tried burning their clothes to get rid of the infestation. Others shaved their heads, which is why many pirates were bald, not just for style but for self-defense. Of course, if you burned your shirt, you'd have to steal a new one off the next ship, which meant new lice. The cycle continued forever. The surgeon and his toolbox of horror. Every ship had what they called a surgeon. This sounds professional until you realize the qualifications usually included owns a knife and isn't afraid of blood. Their tools were simple: a bone saw for amputations, a hook for pulling out bullets, forceps, sometimes cleaned, sometimes not, and a bucket of seawater. Pain relief? If you were lucky, you got enough to pass out before they started cutting. Huh? Well, you screamed loudly. There were no sterilization methods. Instruments were wiped on rags, maybe rinsed in salt water, then reused. Infection was inevitable. If you survived an amputation, you faced days of fever, swelling, and the delightful risk of gangrene, the slow blackening and death of tissue. The smell could knock a man unconscious. Surgeons tried to cut quickly, sometimes in less than 2 minutes. Efficiency was the only kindness they could offer. And yet, the patients often thanked them afterward, because in that world, still alive was considered a medical success. Venereal diseases, the shore leave special. When pirates hit port, they didn't exactly head to church. They went to taverns, brothels, and gambling dens, usually in that order. And thus began the endless spread of syphilis and gonorrhea, the twin horrors of every seafaring man. Symptoms ranged from mildly unpleasant to "my nose has fallen off." The advanced stages of syphilis caused blindness, paralysis, and madness. Some pirates were convinced they were cursed or haunted. The treatments were arguably worse. Mercury was the go-to cure. Yes, the toxic metal. Doctors believed it purged the illness from your body. So sailors rubbed mercury ointment into their sores or inhaled mercury vapor. They drooled, shook, lost their teeth, and occasionally their minds. Imagine a crew of half-mad, mercury-poisoned men trying to steer a ship in a storm. That was piracy. Freedom, but with a rash. Malaria and the tropics. Many pirates operated in the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Indian Ocean, warm, mosquito-filled regions where malaria thrived. They called it the fever. No one knew how it spread, only that it struck suddenly, with chills, sweating, and violent shivering. Crews tried to fight it with rum, opium, or sheer denial. None of it worked. Those who survived remained weak for weeks. Many never recovered fully. Ships sometimes lost half their crews before ever reaching a battle. When European governments later wondered why their colonial sailors kept dying, the answer was simple: mosquitoes were better killers than cannonballs. Mental decay on the high seas. It wasn't just the body that suffered. The mind did. Long voyages meant endless isolation, monotony, and fear. The horizon never changed. The sound of the waves, constant. The smell, unbearable. Sleep was broken into short shifts, interrupted by storms or alarms. The human brain slowly unraveled under that pressure. Sailors became paranoid, hallucinated voices, or started talking to rats. Some jumped overboard for no reason. Others lashed out violently. Pirate ships often had rules against mad behavior, but enforcing them was tricky when half the crew was half mad already. Many captains simply ignored it. As long as a man could hold a rope or fire a gun, his sanity was considered adequate. Storms, accidents, and other unheroic deaths. And then there were the accidents, the quiet, stupid deaths that never made it into legends. Falling from the rigging, crushed by a swinging boom, swept overboard by a rogue wave. No ceremony, no grave, no song. Just gone. The ocean doesn't keep souvenirs. Sometimes the crew said a few words, tossed a plank, and kept sailing. More often, they didn't bother. Time was too precious and space too limited for sentimentality. For all the talk of brotherhood and loyalty, the pirate's greatest companion was the sea, and it was an unforgiving one. Burial at sea, a brief, salty farewell. When someone did die on board, from disease, battle, or boredom, the body had to go overboard quickly. Burials at sea were brisk. A few words, a sheet, maybe a weight tied to the feet. Then, splash. Gone. Superstitions ran deep. Some pirates believed a dead body on board brought bad luck. Others thought it could curse the ship if not buried properly. So, even the dead didn't get much rest. Sometimes storms tore the corpses free, washing them back onto the deck or nearby shores, a grim reminder that the ocean wasn't sentimental either. Rum, medicine for everything. Despite all this, pirates had one universal remedy: rum. Scurvy? Limb missing? Extra rum. It dulled the pain, killed some bacteria, and numbed the horror of existence. Crews drank constantly, partially to sterilize their water, mostly to forget their lives. Drunkenness was not a vice, it was survival. The hangovers, though, were legendary. One pirate captain reportedly banned drinking before battle, but only because his men kept forgetting which ship to attack. The calm after the fever. What's strange, almost poetic, is how normal all of this was. For pirates, sickness wasn't a crisis. It was part of the weather, something you endured. They didn't have the luxury of health, only the endurance of the half-dead. And yet, somehow, they kept sailing. Through fevers, plagues, storms, and loss. Because the only thing worse than dying at sea was dying on land, forgotten, ordinary, and poor. At least out here, you could pretend the horizon was freedom, not a boundary. Let's drift quietly now into the next chapter, where we'll explore the economics of piracy. Because beneath the grime and disease was an entire shadow economy of gold, lies, and rum-fueled bookkeeping. Chapter 4. The economics of piracy, gold, greed, and very bad math. Piracy, despite all its blood and bluster, was really just bad accounting with cannons. At its heart, it was a business, chaotic, unethical, and run almost entirely by men who couldn't count past 20 without removing their boots. Everyone imagines pirates burying gold on deserted islands, drawing cute little maps, and marking them with an X. In reality, most pirates didn't bury treasure. They spent it, instantly, and usually on things that made sure they'd need to go pirating again next week. So, tonight, let's glide into the grubby financial underbelly of piracy, a world of stolen goods, drunken bartering, and creative math that would make an accountant weep. How piracy actually paid? Barely. When pirates captured a ship, they didn't always find gold or silver. In fact, most merchant ships carried much less exciting cargo. Barrels of sugar, tobacco, cotton, rum, lots of rum, and the occasional unfortunate shipment of salted fish. These weren't exactly treasures. They were commodities, which meant pirates had to sell or trade them for money. That's where the chaos began. Pirate ships usually sailed to hidden ports, corrupt harbors, or isolated coves where black market merchants waited, ready to buy stolen goods at insultingly low prices. If you just risked your life in a cannon fight to seize a cargo of molasses, congratulations. You could now sell it for a handful of coins and a hangover. It was like robbing a bank only to realize you'd stolen coupons. The Articles of Agreement, pirate paperwork. Every ship had a set of rules called Articles of Agreement. Think of them as employee contracts written in rum. These documents laid out how the loot would be divided, who got bonuses, and what counted as unacceptable behavior. They sound civilized, and honestly, they were, in their own anarchic way. For example, here's a very typical clause. Every man shall have an equal vote in affairs of moment. He shall have equal title to fresh provisions or strong liquors at any time seized. Democracy at sea, in between knife fights. Loot division usually went like this. The captain got 2 shares. The quartermaster got 1.5 shares. Specialists, like carpenters or gunners, got 1.25 shares. Everyone else got 1 share. Sounds fair, until you remember that a share might amount to about 10 pounds after months of danger. Enough to buy new boots, some alcohol, and possibly 1 emotional breakdown. The only truly rich pirates were the ones who retired before they were caught. Which is to say, almost none of them. The quartermaster, pirate HR. The quartermaster was basically the pirate ship's accountant, judge, and HR manager rolled into one. A thrilling combination that somehow didn't end in immediate mutiny. He was in charge of distributing loot, settling disputes, and ensuring fairness. Captains could lead battles, but quartermasters controlled the purse strings. If a captain got too greedy or too cruel, the crew could vote him out, often with minimal paperwork and maximum yelling. This kept some balance, though it also meant pirate ships spent roughly half their time arguing about fairness. Nothing says freedom like an endless staff meeting on a rotting deck. The myth of buried treasure. Now, about that buried treasure myth. It's almost entirely made up. The idea came from a few rare cases, most famously Captain William Kidd, who allegedly buried some of his loot before being captured in 1699. When rumors spread, the world lost its collective mind. Treasure maps, secret islands, X marks the spot. All fiction. Pirates didn't bury money, they drank it. Coins and jewels were exchanged for alcohol, food, and other fleeting comforts. Some bought fancy clothes or jewelry, because what better way to stay undercover than dressing like a flamboyant parrot in a silk waistcoat? Within a week or two of a successful raid, most pirates were broke again, squinting at the horizon for their next paycheck via violence. It was the world's most inefficient financial system. The pirate supply chain. Pirates didn't operate in isolation. They were part of a vast, shady network of traders, officials, and middlemen who made money off their crimes. Port towns like Nassau, Port Royal, and Tortuga were the beating hearts of this black market economy. Merchants there were happy to forget where the goods came from, as long as they could buy cheap and sell dear. Local governors, often poorly paid and conveniently corrupt, looked the other way. Even respectable European companies quietly bought stolen cargoes when it suited them. Piracy, in short, wasn't rebellion, it was outsourced capitalism. And pirates were just freelance employees who happened to use swords instead of invoices. Prize money and the delusion of wealth. Every pirate dreamed of the big score, the single glorious haul that would let them retire forever. But in reality, these jackpots almost never happened. Even the legendary Black Bart Roberts, one of the most successful pirates in history, rarely saw massive treasure. He captured over 400 ships, but most yielded only modest profits. His greatest prize, a Portuguese ship loaded with gold dust and coins, was the exception, not the rule. And even that didn't make him safe. He was killed shortly after, shot through the neck during battle. The gold didn't help him much. It's the same sad pattern. Pirates died chasing fortunes that would mostly have bought them about 3 weeks of happiness and a lifetime of liver failure. Spending habits, disaster on land. When pirates finally got ashore with money, things went downhill fast. After months of deprivation, they hit the ports like human hurricanes. Taverns filled up instantly. Musicians played until dawn. Food, drink, and sex were consumed at record speed. The spending sprees were legendary. One pirate reportedly blew his entire share, equivalent to several $1,000s today, in a single night. On what no one knows. But it likely involved rum, gambling, and bad decisions. Within days, the crew would be penniless again, begging tavern keepers for credit or stealing boats to get back to sea. If there was ever a pirate retirement plan, it involved getting hanged before the bar tab came due. Pirate economy versus empire economy. The irony is that piracy existed because of the empires they robbed. The 17th and 18th centuries were all about trade, European nations building vast maritime systems to move silver, sugar, slaves, and spices. Ships sailed constantly between the colonies and Europe, loaded with wealth. And wherever there's concentrated wealth, there will always be desperate people trying to redistribute it with knives. Pirates were just the inevitable byproduct of imperial greed, the ocean's unwanted side effect. Every law passed against piracy was really a law to protect profit margins. The Navy didn't hunt pirates for justice. It hunted them for insurance purposes. Privateers. Piracy with a license. Here's the real twist. The line between pirate and patriot was razor thin. Many respectable sea captains were actually privateers, pirates who had a government permission slip. A letter of marque allowed them to attack enemy ships legally during wartime. It was the perfect loophole. You could rob, burn, and loot, as long as you promised to only do it to the right people. Privateering made fortunes for men like Francis Drake and Henry Morgan, who later became national heroes. When the war ended, though, those same men often kept on looting, except now they were technically criminals. Nothing really changed except the paperwork. It's a bit like someone being fired from a company but continuing to use the corporate credit card. The looting hierarchy. Pirates also had an informal hierarchy for dividing goods. First came the ship itself, often renamed and added to the fleet. Next, valuable cargo, gold, silver, jewels, or fine fabrics. Then trade goods, sugar, cocoa, tobacco, lumber. Finally, personal possessions, clothing, instruments, and occasionally human beings, either for ransom or forced labor. But they also took ridiculous things. Diaries, pets, fancy hats. Anything that looked like it might impress the next port tavern crowd. A captain once stole a gilded birdcage, with no bird, simply because it looked expensive. That sums up pirate economics. High risk, low sense. Pirates and inflation. Because pirates spent money as soon as they got it, port economies inflated dramatically. After a major raid, prices for rum, food, and lodging could triple overnight. Merchants knew the pirates were rich and drunk, the best kind of customers. Some ports even depended on pirate income. Nassau, for instance, was nearly bankrupt before the pirates showed up. Within a decade, it was thriving, albeit full of armed drunks and unpaid debts. Pirates were bad for morality, but excellent for business. Retirement, or what passed for it. A few pirates did retire, usually the clever ones who quit early and invested in something boring, like land or trading. Henry Morgan did just that. After years of pillaging Spanish settlements, he settled down, became the lieutenant governor of Jamaica, and started prosecuting pirates himself. Nothing like a good bit of hypocrisy to round out a career. Others tried to go straight, opening taverns or small shops. But the sea had a way of calling them back. Poverty was persuasive. Most returned to piracy or were executed for it. The few who actually lived out their days quietly were so rare they became legends. The real treasure. Here's the thing no one likes to admit. Most pirates didn't want gold. Not really. They wanted freedom. Or at least the illusion of it. Money was just a ticket to one more night of choice. Drink, laugh, sleep, spend, repeat. Their economy wasn't designed to last. It was designed to burn fast and bright, like their lives. And maybe, in a strange way, that was the point. To take everything the world denied them, power, control, agency, and spend it immediately before someone took it back. It's bad business, yes, but a strangely human one. Let's drift ahead to the next quiet catastrophe, the fall of piracy itself. How governments finally decided they'd had enough of these drunken accountants with swords and wiped them from the seas. Chapter 5. The Fall of the Pirates, How the Empires Finally Got Their Act Together. By the early 18th century, piracy was getting inconvenient. It wasn't that kings and merchants suddenly developed a conscience, please. It was that piracy had become expensive. Trade ships were vanishing, insurance premiums were skyrocketing, and entire colonial economies were wobbling because some guy named Calico Jack couldn't stop stealing sugar. Empires don't mind crime when it's profitable, but when it starts denting profit margins, they bring the hammer down. And so, around the 1710s, the slow, bureaucratic extermination of pirates began, not in a flash of heroism, but in a long, paperwork-filled sigh of irritation. The end of the Golden Age. The so-called Golden Age of piracy lasted barely 30 years, roughly 1690 to 1720, which is not particularly golden for anyone involved. It began after the War of the Spanish Succession, when thousands of sailors suddenly found themselves unemployed. Privateers who had been legally looting Spanish ships were now out of work, and very reluctant to return to normal jobs that didn't involve sword fights. So, they simply didn't. They kept doing what they were good at, just without the government permission slip. And for a while it worked beautifully. But by 1715, piracy had exploded. The Caribbean, the American coast, and parts of West Africa were infested with ships flying the Jolly Roger. To put it in perspective, by 1718, there were an estimated 2,000 pirates active in the Caribbean alone. That's more pirates than there were Royal Navy sailors stationed there. It was chaos. Fun, lucrative, and extremely bad for business. Governors, bribes, and backroom deals. The first line of defense against pirates was, hilariously, local colonial governors. And these men were, to put it politely, variable in quality. Some tried to fight piracy. Others, like the early governors of Nassau, were practically honorary pirates themselves. When the British Crown told the governor of the Bahamas to stop aiding pirates, he shrugged and said the island would collapse without them. He wasn't wrong. Pirate money kept the taverns full and the market busy. For years, governors accepted bribes or gifts in exchange for turning a blind eye. Pirate captains like Henry Jennings and Charles Vane even had informal arrangements with officials who warned them when naval patrols were nearby. It was like running a protection racket, but with extra steps. But eventually, London got tired of the excuses. Trade had to flow. Investors had to sleep at night. So the empire began cleaning house. The royal pardon, a brief, boring attempt at mercy. In 1717, King George I issued a royal pardon for all pirates who surrendered within a year. The idea was simple: come in, say sorry, stop stealing things. No more hangings, no more chasing. And surprisingly, it sort of worked, at first. Hundreds of pirates turned themselves in. Many wanted out anyway. They were broke, tired, and full of scurvy. Some even became law-abiding sailors again. But others, the stubborn ones, took the pardon, enjoyed the peace, then went right back to piracy the next month. Because really, who was going to check? It turned into an embarrassing cycle of forgive, forget, repeat. Finally, in 1718, Britain decided to handle things the old-fashioned way: ships, soldiers, and public executions. Enter Woodes Rogers, the man who hated fun. The British Crown appointed Woodes Rogers as the new governor of the Bahamas, specifically to fix the pirate problem. Rogers was a former privateer himself, which meant he understood both the temptation and the logistics of piracy. He also had absolutely no sense of humor about it. When he arrived in Nassau in 1718, the island was basically a pirate retirement home, a drunk, sunburned mess of stolen ships and cheap rum. He sailed in with warships, blockaded the harbor, and announced his mission with the subtlety of a sledgehammer: expel the pirates or hang them. Dozens surrendered immediately. The rest fled. Charles Vane tried to resist, of course, but even he eventually ran out of friends, ships, and excuses. Rogers reinstated British law, banned piracy, and restored trade. He also introduced something pirates hadn't seen in years: bureaucracy. Nothing kills rebellion faster than paperwork. The naval crackdown. The Royal Navy finally decided to get serious. Dedicated anti-pirate squadrons began patrolling the Caribbean, the American coast, and West Africa. These weren't the clumsy old galleons of the past. These were lean, fast warships with actual discipline. Captains were given authority to capture or kill pirates on sight. No trials, no negotiations, just quick justice and quicker hangings. The shift in tone was immediate. Pirates who once swaggered around Nassau were suddenly running for their lives, hiding in remote coves or turning on one another for rewards. The age of cheerful anarchy was replaced by quiet fear. The fall of the big names. Every legendary pirate met their inevitable, depressing end during this cleanup campaign. Blackbeard, the poster child of piracy, was hunted down in 1718 by Lieutenant Robert Maynard off the coast of North Carolina. The battle was short and vicious. Blackbeard was shot and stabbed multiple times, finally decapitated. His head was hung from the bow of Maynard's ship like a trophy. The message was clear: the fun was over. Charles Vane, defiant to the last, was captured a year later and hanged in Jamaica. Calico Jack Rackham, lover of fine clothes and worse luck, was caught by surprise in 1720. His crew, including the famous and Bonnie and Mary Red, were captured. Rackham was hanged, while the two women escaped execution by pleading the belly they were pregnant. And Black Bart Roberts, perhaps the most successful pirate ever, was killed in 1722 off West Africa during a naval assault. His death effectively ended organized piracy on a large scale. By the mid-1720s, the era of the great pirates was finished. Public hangings and morality plays. Governments didn't just execute pirates, they performed their executions. In London, Port Royal, and the American colonies, hangings were public spectacles, complete with printed pamphlets and sermons. Crowds gathered to watch former sea devils swing. Ministers lectured on sin. Merchants clapped approvingly, pretending they'd never done business with the deceased. The corpses were often tarred and hung in iron cages along the shore, gibbeting, as it was called, so other sailors would see them rotting and think twice. Nothing says civilization like using a human skeleton as nautical decoration. The age of romantic piracy sank beneath the tide, replaced by a more boring, corporate kind of theft called colonialism. The pirates who survived. A few clever souls slipped away. Some accepted pardons and became merchant captains. Others faked their deaths or vanished into the colonies, living quietly under new names. A few even returned to sea as fishermen, a depressing downgrade, but at least no one was trying to hang them. And Bonnie and Mary Red, the most famous women of the era, left history on a question mark. Mary died in prison, and supposedly disappeared after her release. Some rumors claim she lived out her days as a quiet farmer's wife, raising children who had no idea their mother once terrorized the Caribbean. It's an oddly fitting fate, the sea devoured by the shore. Pirates turned legends. Even as they were exterminated, pirates began their second life, in legend. Writers, ballads, and cheap pamphlets started romanticizing them almost immediately. By the mid-18th century, pirates were no longer villains. They were rebellious heroes in a world ruled by dull merchants. The real, diseased, penniless truth of piracy faded into myth, replaced by adventure stories, treasure maps, and moral ambiguity wrapped in sea spray. Every hanging birthed another tale. Every execution inspired another song. And by the time Robert Louis Stevenson published Treasure Island in 1883, piracy had gone from a nightmare to a bedtime story. Why piracy died? The death of piracy wasn't about morality. It was about logistics. The Royal Navy expanded. Colonial administration tightened. Trade routes became better protected. And, perhaps most importantly, there were fewer easy targets. The world had grown up, or at least grown organized. The wild, open edges of empire had been mapped, fortified, and monetized. Pirates needed chaos to thrive, and empires were getting too efficient for that. So, piracy as a major force with flags and fleets simply evaporated. The ocean was no longer a playground for desperate men, it was a spreadsheet. The quiet end. By the 1730s, piracy was less an empire-wide crisis and more an occasional nuisance. A ship here, a raid there, nothing that made London lose sleep. The last major figure, William Fly, was hanged in 1726. His death was used as one final warning to sailors tempted by the old dream of freedom at sea. But by then, piracy had already become memory. Taverns once filled with stolen rum now served tax-paying merchants. The Jolly Roger flags rotted in forgotten caves. And the seas that once echoed with laughter, gunfire, and very bad sea shanties went quiet again. The irony of it all. In the end, piracy wasn't destroyed by morality or justice. It was outcompete. Governments learned to be pirates themselves, just with uniforms and letters of authority. The same empires that hanged thieves at dawn were quietly looting half the planet by noon. The pirates were simply too honest about it. And maybe that's why their legend lingers. Because they showed us what the world really looked like: greed with no pretense, theft without a flag. The sea remembers. Today, the Caribbean is quiet. But somewhere beneath the waves, the bones of ships and men still rest. Wooden ribs tangled with coral, cannonballs half buried in sand. The sea forgets slowly. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the faint echo of laughter from men who mistook chaos for freedom and went down believing it was worth the price. Let's drift into the next chapter, into the strange, uneasy peace that followed. The merchants, the navy men, and the strange afterlife of pirate myths that refused to stay buried. Chapter 6: The Ghost of Piracy, How Legends Replaced the Men. By the time the last real pirate swung from a noose, the world had already started pretending they'd been something else entirely. History is funny like that. It forgets the dirt but keeps the drama. So, while the actual pirates died poor, drunk, and unshaven, their imaginary versions were already being reborn, with better manners, whiter teeth, and a suspiciously theatrical sense of adventure. This is how we ended up with pirates who sing songs, wear clean boots, and somehow find buried treasure on demand. The real men rotted. The legends got book deals. The first pirate stories. The first pirate biographies appeared before the Golden Age had even ended. In 1724, an anonymous book called A General History of the Pirates was published in London. It claimed to be written by one Captain Charles Johnson, a name no one could confirm or deny. Whoever he was, he shaped everything we now think of when we say pirate. The book described the lives of figures like Blackbeard and Bonnie and Calico Jack, all in vivid, occasionally exaggerated detail. It was part moral warning, part gossip magazine, and part fantasy. Readers loved it, especially the bits where pirates turned out to have personalities. Blackbeard, for example, became less a violent criminal and more a theatrical villain. A man who tied burning fuses into his beard just for dramatic effect. Which, yes, he actually did, but probably not as often or as stylishly as the book suggested. Still, A General History made piracy glamorous. It turned desperate men into dangerous heroes, and polite society couldn't get enough. Pirates for the armchair adventurer. The 18th century was full of people who would never see the sea but loved pretending they understood it. Tales of pirates gave them an escape, adventure without risk, rebellion without guilt. You could sip tea in London and read about a man sailing into a storm, fighting the Spanish, and laughing at death. It was thrilling, and importantly, it made empire look exciting, not cruel. The pirates became the bad boys of the colonial world, reckless but charming, dangerous but fun to read about from the safety of your chaise longue. By the mid-18th century, the pirate had already become entertainment. The stage pirate. It didn't take long for pirates to leap from the page to the stage. Plays began popping up across Britain, France, and even the American colonies, featuring dashing rogues with swords, sashes, and suspiciously good lighting. The real-life poverty and disease of piracy didn't exactly sell tickets. But romance, freedom, and rebellion did. Audiences wanted adventure. They got costumes. Even the language of piracy, avast, arr, and all those dramatic O's, came mostly from stage scripts, not ships. No one actually said, at sea unless they were choking. But it sounded good echoing off the theater walls. The Victorian makeover. Fast forward a century. The world had changed. By the 1800s, empire was polished, industrialized, and deeply self-righteous. Which, naturally, meant it needed rebellious stories to spice it up a bit. Enter the Victorians, a society obsessed with moral order by day and scandalous fantasy by night. Pirates fit perfectly. They became the romantic rebels of the past, dangerous enough to be exciting, but dead enough not to cause trouble. Writers like Robert Louis Stevenson gave them new life. When Treasure Island came out in 1883, it redefined the pirate myth for good. Gone were the lice, the scurvy, and the endless financial incompetence. In came treasure maps, parrots, and code-bound captains with hearts of tarnished gold. Stevenson's Long John Silver wasn't a monster. He was charming. He lied, schemed, and stole, but he was also witty, brave, and somehow likable. It was piracy for the moral middle class, sanitized, serialized, and suitable for bedtime reading. The flag that wouldn't die. The Jolly Roger, that skull and crossbones, also got its mythic glow-up. In truth, not every pirate used it. Some preferred red flags, others used variations with hourglasses or skeletons stabbing hearts. But the black flag with the skull stuck. It was simple, dramatic, and deeply marketable. It became the shorthand for rebellion. By the late 19th century, you could find the Jolly Roger on everything from tobacco tins to naval paintings. It had gone from a symbol of terror to a kind of cultural brand. which, in hindsight, is about as piratey as it gets. The children's pirate. Somehow, by the 20th century, pirates became adorable. Children's books, comics, and early films turned them into swashbuckling caricatures, full of rumbling voices and friendly eye patches. Peter Pan gave us Captain Hook, the pirate as cartoon villain. Dangerous, yes, but also ridiculous. He was less a killer and more a man perpetually outwitted by a flying child. Then came Hollywood, which decided pirates were basically just misunderstood actors in leather boots. The Pirates of the Caribbean ride opened at Disneyland in 1967, promising yo-ho instead of you're dead. By the time the films rolled around in the 2000s, the pirate was fully reborn. Part rock star, part clown, part nostalgic fantasy. The transformation was complete. The most feared criminals of the 18th century were now theme park mascots. The real legacy beneath the glitter. Under all the costume jewelry and rum jokes, something real still lingers. Pirates have always represented a tiny flicker of resistance, even if it was messy, selfish, and often delusional. They were people who refused to live by the empire's rules. And yes, they robbed, murdered, and drank themselves into oblivion, but they also created small, temporary worlds of equality and autonomy. For a brief time, poor men from every corner of the world shared the same deck, voted on their leaders, and divided spoils equally. That's not romantic. It's revolutionary. And maybe that's why the myth keeps resurfacing, because somewhere in that mess of greed and rum, there's a glimpse of freedom that feels strangely familiar. Modern piracy, the unfun sequel. Of course, piracy didn't actually vanish. It just changed shape. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new pirates appeared not in tricorn hats, but in motorboats off Somalia, Indonesia, and the Gulf of Guinea. These were not the charming rogues of storybooks. They were desperate men in collapsing economies, hijacking ships out of survival, not swagger. And, inevitably, the media called them modern pirates, as if Blackbeard had come back with a GPS and a fuel budget. The irony? They had more in common with the originals than we'd like to admit: poverty, lawlessness, and empires that ignored them until they became inconvenient. The more things change, the more they just float in circles. The pirate is mirror. Every generation gets the pirate it deserves. For the 18th century, he was a terrifying rebel. For the Victorians, a romantic scoundrel. For us, he's a theme park antihero with good hair and eyeliner. But beneath all that, the figure of the pirate has always reflected what society secretly envies: the illusion of freedom without responsibility. He sails beyond the laws, answers to no one, and laughs in the face of authority. Of course, real pirates didn't live that way. They were broke, sick, and constantly terrified. But legends are better company than truth, especially at bedtime. The ghost ship. And so, the last image we're left with isn't a battle or a hanging, it's a ghost ship. A creaking silhouette in the fog. Sails torn, lantern glowing faintly. A memory of rebellion still drifting in circles. The crew are long gone, but their stories cling to the air, retold, repainted, reimagined until they've become something else entirely. The sea keeps them as it keeps all lost things. And every now and then, a writer, a child, or a sleepless historian catches a glimpse of that shadow and decides to bring it ashore again. So, that's how it ends. Not with a cannon blast or a treasure chest, but with a whisper. The pirates are gone. The myths remain. And somewhere out there, in the quiet dark of an endless ocean, their ghosts are still laughing. Chapter 7. The Women of the Waves, Forgotten Female Pirates. If you believe the history written by 18th century men, you'd think the high seas were basically a floating bachelor party, nothing but sweat, grog, and bad manners. But that's the problem with history written by men who didn't actually look around. Women were there. And sometimes, they were the ones giving the orders. The problem with being a woman at sea. Let's start with the obvious. Society wasn't exactly welcoming to adventurous women. In most ports, women weren't even allowed to board naval ships, let alone join crews. The sea was considered bad luck for them, because, of course, everything unlucky had to be a woman's fault. So for a woman to become a pirate, She had to break not just the law, but the idea of womanhood itself, which, in a way, made them the most dangerous kind of outlaw imaginable. Mary Read and Bonny, the double storm. If you know anything about female pirates, you probably know these two names, Mary Read and Bonny, and with good reason. Their story has everything: disguises, rebellion, betrayal, and a whole lot of questionable decision-making. They sailed together under the command of the flamboyant pirate Calico Jack Rackham in the early 1700s, a man known for wearing brightly patterned clothes and making very poor life choices. And Bonny was born in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his servant. She was smart, fiery, and allergic to obedience. She married a small-time sailor, but quickly got bored, ditched him, and ran off to the Caribbean, where she met Rackham. Mary Read's story was even stranger. Born in England, she was raised as a boy. Her mother disguised her to keep receiving financial support from a deceased relative. Mary kept the disguise into adulthood, joined the army as Mark Red, and fought in Europe before ending up in the Caribbean, where she eventually joined Rackham's crew too. When Anne and Mary met, it was like lightning hitting open water. They both dressed as men aboard ship, but everyone quickly learned that the disguise was mostly symbolic. They could outfight, outcurse, and outdrink most of the men on board. According to legend, and to a general history of the pirates, when Rackham's ship was finally captured in 1720 by a privateer, most of the male crew were too drunk to fight. Anne and Mary, however, refused to surrender. They fought fiercely until they were overpowered. When sentenced to hang, both revealed they were pregnant, which delayed their executions. Mary died in prison, likely of fever, and simply vanished. There's no record of her execution. Some say her wealthy father pulled strings to free her. Others claim she escaped and lived quietly somewhere under a new name. Either way, she walked off the page of history like a final act of defiance. The forgotten ones, Fanny Campbell and Grace O'Malley. Mary and Anne are the famous pair, but they were far from alone. Centuries before them, in 16th century Ireland, there was Grace O'Malley, or Grain Mhale in Gaelic, a chieftain, seafarer, and literal pirate queen who ruled the western coast. She commanded hundreds of men, owned her own fleet, and raided English ships while negotiating directly with Queen Elizabeth I, woman to woman, monarch to monarch. Legend says Grace once met the queen at court wearing a dagger under her gown and refused to bow, claiming she recognized no sovereign above the sea. Elizabeth reportedly respected her for it. Grace died old, rich, and still free, which puts her in an elite category of pirates who didn't end their days dangling from a rope. Then there's Fanny Campbell, an American woman from the early 1800s who disguised herself as a man, became a sailor, and ended up leading a mutiny to free an imprisoned crew. Her story became the subject of a popular 1844 novel, Fanny Campbell, The Female Pirate Captain, which inspired countless girls to dream of life beyond landlocked expectations. The line between fact and fiction blurred, but the message was clear. Women could be just as daring, reckless, and capable as any man with a cutlass. Ching Shi, the woman who owned the sea. And then there was Ching Shi, the most successful pirate in history. Not just the most successful female pirate, the most successful anyone. Early 19th century China was a chaotic place for sailors. The South China Sea was crawling with pirate fleets, but none as vast or organized as Ching Shi's. She started as a prostitute in Canton, captured by pirates, and married their leader, the formidable Cheng Ai. When he died, she took over. And by took over, I mean she commanded up to 70,000 men and 1,800 ships. She built an empire of piracy so large it was practically its own government, complete with tax systems, written codes of conduct, and severe punishments for disobedience. Her rules were clear. Anyone who disobeyed her was executed. Anyone who assaulted women captives was executed. Anyone who tried to keep plunder for themselves, executed. She turned piracy into a functioning military regime, and beat both the Chinese Navy and the European colonial powers who tried to stop her. Eventually, the government offered her amnesty, which she accepted, keeping her wealth and retiring peacefully. Let's pause on that. She ran the largest pirate fleet in human history and retired rich, alive, and married to a younger man. Meanwhile, her male counterparts were mostly skeletons by 30. If that's not power, I don't know what is. Why we forgot them? So why did women like Ching Shi and Bonnie and Grace O'Malley get pushed to the edges of history? Simple, they didn't fit the narrative. Piracy was supposed to be a masculine rebellion, wild, free, and deeply, aggressively male. A woman in command shattered that illusion. And history, especially 18th and 19th century history, didn't like women who shattered things. Writers preferred to describe female pirates as exceptions, scandals, or curiosities. They were never allowed to be simply pirates. It's the same reason ancient queens were called she-wolves and female warriors were unnatural. Power, when worn by a woman, was always rewritten as a moral problem. The pirate queen archetype. Over time, though, these women turned into something else, symbols. By the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, writers began to romanticize them, much like their male counterparts. But there was a twist. They became metaphors for independence, not danger. And Bonnie was reimagined as a fiery lover, Mary Red as a noble crossdresser, and Grace O'Malley as a national hero. They stopped being outlaws and started being folk icons, sanitizing them just enough to make them inspiring, not threatening. Even Ching Shi, in modern retellings, is often portrayed as a shrewd strategist more than a ruthless conqueror. It's as if history wanted to keep their brilliance but take away the blood. Women and the idea of rebellion. What all these stories share is rebellion, not against nations but against roles. A man who became a pirate was rejecting authority. A woman who became a pirate was rejecting the entire social order. That's why they fascinated and terrified their contemporaries. They didn't just sail against empires, they sailed against the idea that women were meant to be silent passengers in history. Each one, in her own way, declared that freedom was not a masculine privilege. And for that, they were erased, rewritten, or turned into legends. The last left. Here's the thing, you can hang a pirate, but you can't kill an idea. Centuries later, and Bonnie's ghost still shows up in novels, TV shows, and songs. Grace O'Malley is celebrated in Irish folklore. Ching Shi is studied in business schools as a model of ruthless leadership, seriously. The world keeps rediscovering them, because the idea of a woman commanding her own ship, living on her own terms, and refusing to apologize for it still feels revolutionary. The final voyage. So maybe the story of female pirates isn't just a historical footnote. Maybe it's a reminder that rebellion wears many faces, some bearded, some not. That even in a world built to silence them, some women found a way to shout across the waves. And that the sea, vast and indifferent, doesn't care who steers the ship, only whether you dare to. So, as we drift off again, imagine them there. Anne and Mary, laughing in the moonlight. Grace, dagger hidden, sailing home through Irish fog. Ching Shi, calm and regal, watching an empire bow before her. Their sails, still ghosting across the horizon, whispering a simple truth, that freedom, once claimed, never really sinks. Chapter 8. Empire, Trade, and the Death of the Golden Age. Let's drift away from the rum and rebellion for a bit. The gunpowder smoke has cleared, the shouting has stopped, and the sails are tattered. We're now somewhere in the early 18th century. The sea is still vast, but it's getting organized. Piracy, as we've known it, is about to suffocate under the weight of paperwork, commerce, and bureaucracy. The very things pirates hated most, order, discipline, rules, are about to take over the oceans completely. This is where our story shifts from loud chaos to quiet control. The end of the Golden Age. Historians like to call the early 1700s the Golden Age of piracy. But really, it was golden only for the pirates, and even then, briefly. It lasted barely 3 decades, roughly from the 1690s to the 1720s, before the great powers of Europe collectively decided they were tired of losing cargo, ships, and face. By 1725, the party was over. Most of the major pirate captains, Blackbeard, Rackham, Bellamy, and the rest, were dead, hanged, or rotting somewhere unpleasant. And the oceans that once felt wild and free? They were slowly being domesticated by empire. The navies of Britain, France, and Spain expanded massively, patrolling trade routes with a new kind of efficiency. Convoys replaced single merchant ships. Insurance companies began operating across the Atlantic. Pirate havens, like Nassau, Port Royal, and Tortuga, were wiped clean or turned into military outposts. The free sea, once an outlaw's playground, became an accountant's dream. Why empires suddenly cared? For most of the 1600s, empires didn't actually mind pirates too much. As long as the plundering didn't hit their ships, piracy was a convenient way to weaken rivals. Privateers, for instance, were state-approved pirates. They had legal documents, letters of marque, that basically said, go rob people, just make sure they're the right people. It was a way for nations to wage low-cost, low-responsibility warfare at sea. But once the colonial powers began building real global empires, piracy became inconvenient. Merchants couldn't rely on trade if every voyage was a potential hostage situation. Governments couldn't tax goods that never made it to port. And investors, those charming proto-capitalists back in London and Amsterdam, were losing patience. Money, not morality, killed piracy. The British got boring and efficient. No one strangled piracy quite like the British. By the early 18th century, the Royal Navy had transformed from a loose collection of ships into a disciplined, bureaucratic machine. It didn't just fight wars, it enforced global trade. London became the heart of maritime capitalism. Every ship, every crew, every crate of goods was documented, tracked, and insured. Pirates couldn't hide in this new system. Suddenly, a ship wasn't just wood and sailcloth, it was a financial instrument. You can't plunder an Excel spreadsheet. The British Admiralty began issuing global edicts. No more privateers. No more gentlemen of fortune. No more excuses. Pirate trials became public spectacles, designed to make examples of captured crews. Bodies were hung in gibbets, metal cages displayed along the docks, to remind sailors what freedom really cost. The message was clear: trade good, piracy bad. The rise of the company. As pirates fell, corporations rose. The British East India Company and the Dutch VOC became the new rulers of the sea, not through muskets, but through ledgers. They built fortified ports, minted their own coins, signed treaties, and maintained private armies. Essentially, they became floating governments. If piracy had been the Wild West of the sea, the trading companies were the arrival of the railroad. Efficient, inevitable, and utterly soul-crushing. Under company control, the oceans weren't about freedom anymore. They were about monopoly, extraction, and scale. Ships no longer chased glory, they chased profit margins. And yet, in an almost poetic twist, many company men had once been pirates. After the amnesties of the 1720s, hundreds of former buccaneers quietly took jobs as sailors, dockhands, and even naval officers. Freedom was traded for a paycheck. The Caribbean becomes a business. Take Nassau, for example, the famous pirate haven in the Bahamas. Once, it had been a lawless paradise, full of thieves, escaped slaves, and sailors who'd had enough of empire. By 1720, it was burned, blockaded, and rebuilt, this time under strict British rule. Ports that once echoed with drunken songs now echoed with the sound of hammers and trade. Warehouses replaced taverns. Customs officers replaced captains. Piracy was not just eradicated, it was replaced with something more insidious, a system where rebellion wasn't even possible anymore. You could still sail the sea, sure. You just had to fill out the paperwork first. The myth that survived. Even though real piracy died, the idea of it didn't. In fact, the 18th and 19th centuries romanticized it into something almost wholesome. Writers like Daniel Defoe, who probably was a spy for a while because of course he was, started turning pirates into larger-than-life characters. Noble outlaws. Freedom lovers. Misunderstood rebels who just didn't fit into society. It was all very poetic and very inaccurate, but it worked. By the time Treasure Island hit the shelves in the late 1800s, Piracy had completed its cultural makeover. It wasn't crime anymore, it was adventure. Pirates became symbols of freedom in a world getting increasingly industrial, urban, and dull. It's ironic, as the world got safer, the fantasy of danger became fashionable. How piracy became a brand. Fast forward a bit, and the transformation becomes complete. The Jolly Roger, once a symbol that meant "we're about to kill you," turned into the logo of adventure, rebellion, and Halloween costumes. Everything from sports teams to rum bottles started using pirate imagery. Even the British Navy, which once hunted pirates ruthlessly, began naming ships after them. It's capitalism's favorite trick: absorb rebellion. Sell it back to the public. The very system that destroyed piracy then used its ghost to make a profit. Pirates as anti-heroes. The 20th century made pirates even more glamorous. In movies, novels, and eventually, theme parks. Gone were the lice, the scurvy, the constant risk of drowning, and the general smell of unwashed humanity. Instead, we got witty sword fights, flowing coats, and endless eyeliner. We started rooting for the same kind of people we used to hang. And maybe that's the real mark of how the golden age of piracy ended, not with a battle, but with a brand. The rebellion became entertainment. The outlaw became the icon. The sea, once untamed, became a movie set. The quiet irony of civilization. In the end, empire won. Not because it was more righteous, but because it was more organized. The pirates, for all their bravado, couldn't compete with accountants. It's hard to swing a sword at a spreadsheet, but the irony is delicious. Those same empires, those same trade companies that crushed piracy, were themselves stealing entire continents, labor, and resources. The pirates were hanged for stealing gold. The empires got rich for stealing everything else. The legacy that wouldn't sink. Today, we like to pretend pirates disappeared with the 1700s. But they didn't. They just changed uniforms. Modern piracy still exists, in places like the Horn of Africa, the Strait of Malacca, and the Caribbean. But instead of wooden ships and cannonballs, you get speedboats, AK-47s, and satellite phones. And on the other end of the spectrum, corporate piracy lives on too. Mergers, patents, and tax havens doing the same thing, just with better Wi-Fi. The ocean hasn't changed that much. Only the language has. The final wave. So the so-called Golden Age ended not with a fight, but with a shrug. The pirates didn't lose their courage. The world just stopped having space for them. Trade routes became highways. The sea became a system. And freedom, once measured by how far you could sail, became something you had to buy. But deep down, that longing for escape, the dream of leaving everything behind and vanishing into the horizon, never really died. It just hides behind a desk now. As the waves calm, you can almost hear it, the faint whisper of a forgotten crew somewhere beyond the map, laughing at the idea that anyone ever thought the sea could be tamed. Because maybe the true golden age of piracy was never about the gold at all. Maybe it was about the illusion that for a brief, impossible moment in history, a few thousand people actually lived without kings, laws, or clocks. And then the world woke up. Chapter 9. The myth lives on. Pirates in literature, art, and pop culture. Let's stay adrift a little longer. The real pirates are long gone. The gallows creaked, the rum spilled, the Jolly Roger lowered. But the myth? Oh, that one refused to die. In fact, it did the exact opposite. It thrived. It left the sea and settled comfortably into our collective imagination. Shinier, cleaner, and far less likely to give you scurvy. Because when humans lose something wild, we tend to rewrite it into something beautiful. So tonight, let's drift through the afterlife of piracy, the centuries where the legend outlived the law. From the gallows to the page. It started almost immediately after the last hangings. By the 1720s, the press had discovered that pirates sold newspapers. Executions drew huge crowds, so naturally, writers capitalized on the spectacle. Pamphlets, broadsides, and true confessions were printed by the hundreds. Most were complete nonsense, but they were profitable nonsense. And the biggest of them all came in 1724, A General History of the Pirates, published under the name Captain Charles Johnson. It claimed to tell the stories of every major pirate of the age: Blackbeard, Vane, Bonny, Reed, Roberts, Kidd, all of them. The book was thrilling, scandalous, and suspiciously detailed. Modern historians suspect Charles Johnson was a pen name, possibly even Daniel Defoe, the same man who wrote Robinson Crusoe. Because of course the man who invented fictional castaways also moonlighted as the publicist for dead criminals. This single book built the modern image of the pirate: bold, charismatic, defiant, but strangely honorable. It erased the fleas and disease and replaced them with swagger and code. It made villains into folk heroes. And once that switch flipped, there was no going back. The gentleman pirate. By the late 18th century, piracy was being romanticized into something almost elegant. Writers and poets, especially the ones with too much gin and not enough adventure, started imagining the pirate as a kind of tragic anti-hero. They were no longer filthy thieves. They were gentlemen gone wrong. Take Lord Byron, for instance, the original poster boy for doomed, handsome rebellion. His 1814 poem, The Corsair, turned the pirate into a brooding, noble outcast haunted by love and betrayal. It sold 10,000 copies on the first day, which, for poetry, was basically the 19th century version of going viral. Suddenly, pirates weren't scoundrels anymore. They were misunderstood romantics who just happened to own cannons. Byron's version of piracy bled straight into art, theater, and later, early cinema. Swashbucklers replaced sailors. Rebellion became fashion. And thus began the long tradition of everyone completely misunderstanding pirates on purpose, because it was much more fun that way. Treasure Island and the birth of the icon. If there's one moment when the pirate myth fully crystallized, it was 1883, with the publication of Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Before that book, pirates were an idea. After it, they had a uniform. The peg leg, the parrot, the map marked with an X, all of it came from Stevenson. He took scraps of old legends and pamphlets and stitched them into the version of piracy that we still recognize today. His Long John Silver wasn't a monster. He was cunning, likable, dangerous, and oddly charming, the kind of villain you secretly root for. And with that, the pirate became eternal. The image jumped from literature to theater, to children's books, and eventually, to Hollywood. Each retelling made the pirates cleaner, cleverer, and more quotable. They stopped being criminals entirely and became symbols of freedom. The pirate as fantasy. There's something very human about how we've clung to pirates. They represent a kind of escape, the dream of leaving the rules behind, vanishing into the unknown, and answering to no one. By the Victorian era, this fantasy had become especially appealing. Industrial life was rigid, gray, and suffocating. People worked in factories, obeyed schedules, and lived by the clock. So of course the idea of wild, lawless sailors roaming tropical seas felt like pure oxygen. It's the same reason people romanticize cowboys, outlaws, or rebels in leather jackets. We love rebellion as long as it's safely in the past. The silver screen set sail. Then came film. And film turned the myth into a spectacle. Early silent movies like The Sea Hawk, 1924, and Captain Blood, 1935, gave us dashing heroes with perfect hair and shiny swords. By the time Errol Flynn swung across a deck in Technicolor, pirates were officially glamorous. They always fought honorably. They always got the girl. And they almost never smelled like fish. It was delightful, ridiculous, and completely disconnected from reality, but audiences loved it. The pirate became an archetype, a shorthand for adventure, rebellion, and a certain devilish charm. Every generation since has reinvented it to match their own fantasies. From Disney to Johnny Depp. In 1950, Disney released Treasure Island, introducing pirates to an entirely new generation, this time as family entertainment. 2 decades later, Pirates of the Caribbean, the ride, not the movie, opened at Disneyland in 1967. It was full of animatronic men singing about rum and treasure. And honestly, it worked. It was cheerful, harmless piracy, the sanitized dream version. Then, in 2003, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl hit theaters, and changed everything again. Johnny Depp's Jack Sparrow became the modern pirate archetype. Weird, funny, unpredictable, and strangely lovable. He wasn't the hero, but he wasn't the villain either. He was chaos in eyeliner. And once again, audiences couldn't get enough. It was as if the world collectively remembered how fun rebellion used to be. The pirate as meme, lifestyle, and marketing strategy. By the 21st century, piracy had been completely absorbed into pop culture. Not just as entertainment, but as aesthetic. We wear skulls on t-shirts. We say Ahoy for fun. There's talk like a Pirate Day, which somehow became an actual global thing. And of course, the word pirate now also means something entirely different: stealing digital files on the internet. It's kind of poetic. Piracy reinvented itself yet again, this time swapping sales for servers. The parallels are almost too good. Both kinds of pirates defy authority, share loot, and operate just beyond the reach of law. Both claim they're rebelling against greedy corporations. It's piracy's favorite trick: adapt to whatever era needs it most. The myth's hidden depth. Beneath all the parrots and pop songs, there's something deeper. The pirate myth has survived because it touches something timeless: the tension between control and chaos. It's about what happens when people decide they'd rather risk everything than live quietly. Sure, the reality was disease, hunger, and execution. But the idea, the dream of living ungoverned, that's the part that lasts. And every generation keeps reinterpreting it. For some, pirates are rebels against empire. For others, they're metaphors for creativity, freedom, or resistance to conformity. The truth doesn't matter anymore. The story does. Art, symbolism, and the sea. Artists, too, couldn't resist. From the romantic painters of the 1800s to modern illustrators, the pirate ship has become a floating symbol of everything untamed: courage, danger, longing, escape. Storms crash around it. Sunsets glow behind it. And in every version, it's heading towards somewhere you can't quite see. Because the sea, that endless, shapeless space, has always represented freedom. It's no coincidence that pirates, who rejected every boundary, became the perfect subject for art that wanted to do the same. The comfortable rebellion. Today, the pirate myth is safe enough to be fun, dangerous enough to be exciting, and flexible enough to mean whatever you want it to. You can be a corporate executive and still wear a skull ring. You can watch Jack Sparrow while sipping ethically sourced rum. It's rebellion without risk. Freedom without consequences. And maybe that's why it's lasted so long. It lets us flirt with chaos without ever having to live in it. The same way people watch storms from behind glass. The ghost in the waves. But if you listen closely, past the noise of pop culture, there's still a faint echo of the real thing. Not the costumes or the slogans, but the restless energy that drove it all. That quiet refusal to bow. That hunger for something beyond the map. It's what made pirates terrifying in their time and alluring ever since. Because beneath the myth, the movies, and the merchandise, there's still that small, dangerous whisper that maybe, just maybe, there's more to life than following orders. And that's a thought too powerful to sink. Chapter 10. The Return of the Black Flag. Modern piracy in the real world. So, we've sailed through the legends, the literature, and the eyeliner. But it's time to sober up a bit. Because while the myth of piracy lives comfortably on your movie shelf, the real thing never entirely died. It just changed its uniform. Gone are the tricorn hats and flintlocks. Today's pirates use GPS, satellite phones, and AK-47s. They don't bury treasure, they wire it. And they don't fly the Jolly Roger, they fly under the radar. Welcome to the 21st century, where piracy has gone digital, geopolitical, and far less romantic. The sea never sleeps. Let's start with a simple truth. The ocean has no police. Oh, sure, there are coast guards, navies, and international laws. But there are also 63 million square miles of open water. And in many parts of the world, that water is the only way to move goods, people, and power. Every year, over 90% of global trade moves by sea. That means tens of thousands of ships hauling oil, food, electronics, everything you're using right now, through narrow choke points surrounded by poverty, war, and weak governments. It's a perfect setup, because wherever there's desperation, chaos, and money floating by, there will be pirates. Somalia, the deadliest coast in the world. Our story starts on the Horn of Africa. In the 1990s, Somalia's government collapsed completely. There was no navy, no coast guard, and no functioning law. Foreign trawlers swarmed in, illegally fishing Somali waters and dumping toxic waste. Local fishermen fought back. At first, they called themselves coast guards. They boarded ships to demand compensation, a sort of self-declared maritime justice. But justice turned to profit, and profit turned to business. By the mid-2000s, Somali piracy had exploded. Armed gangs operated from coastal towns like Isle and Hobyo, using small speedboats to attack massive cargo vessels hundreds of miles offshore. They used GPS, satellite phones, and motherships, old fishing vessels carrying extra fuel and supplies. They weren't amateurs anymore. They were professionals. The business of hostage-taking. Forget buried treasure, the new loot was ransom. When pirates hijacked a ship, they'd take the crew hostage and anchor the vessel off the Somali coast. Then they'd call the shipping company and demand millions. And unbelievably, it worked. Between 2005 and 2012, Somali pirates earned an estimated $400 million in ransom payments. The biggest single payout? $13.5 million for a South Korean tanker. For comparison, that's more than most Hollywood pirate movies cost to make. Entire coastal economies grew around the trade. Ransom money paid for villas, satellite dishes, and SUVs. Even local businesses, from bakers to phone shops, profited from hostage logistics. It was crime, but it was organized crime, complete with investors and financial backers. Some even bought shares in upcoming hijackings. Piracy had become a stock market, the human cost. But behind the headlines, it was a brutal business. Hostages were often held for months, sometimes years. Conditions were horrific. Crews were chained, beaten, or starved. Ships turned into floating prisons. And for the pirates themselves, the glamour vanished quickly. Most were young, poor, and expendable. They risked being killed by naval patrols or rival gangs. Some were still teenagers who had never seen the inside of a school, suddenly caught between starvation and a stolen rifle. It was a grim echo of the Golden Age, poor men driven to violence by rich men's neglect. The world fights back. By 2009, piracy off Somalia had become a global crisis. The United Nations, NATO, the European Union, and dozens of navies began coordinated patrols in the Gulf of Aden, one of the busiest shipping routes on Earth. Convoys were formed. Private security contractors, ex-soldiers with assault rifles, started riding on commercial ships. Insurance premiums skyrocketed, and slowly the tide turned. By 2013, Somali piracy had dropped by more than 90%. The pirates hadn't all vanished, but the easy money had dried up. Without weak targets or safe havens, their business model collapsed. New frontiers, the South China Sea. But the story didn't end there. It simply moved east. The South China Sea, one of the most heavily trafficked waters in the world, became the new hotbed of maritime crime. This time, it wasn't all hijackings. It was theft, smuggling, and fuel siphoning. Pirates there often targeted small coastal tankers, stealing their cargo or rerouting them under cover of darkness. The operations were fast, precise, and often backed by organized criminal syndicates. It wasn't about ransom anymore. It was about inventory control. And because the area is claimed by half a dozen different countries, enforcement is a diplomatic nightmare. Every pirate can disappear by crossing a few invisible lines on the map. The Straits of Malacca, old waters, new threats. The narrow corridor between Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia has always been a pirate magnet. Even back in the 1600s, European traders dreaded this place. Today, it remains one of the world's riskiest shipping lanes, a bottleneck for over 100,000 ships a year. Modern pirates here use speedboats and automatic weapons, often attacking at night. Some operate as part of local mafias, while others freelance. The attacks are quick, a few minutes at most, grab valuables, maybe siphon some fuel, and vanish among the islands. No parrots. No rum. Just radar blips and profit margins. West Africa, the most dangerous coast today. If you're wondering where piracy is worst right now, look to the Gulf of Guinea, off the coasts of Nigeria, Benin, and Ghana. Here, piracy has taken on its own unique flavor, part kidnapping ring, part oil theft cartel. Armed groups in the Niger Delta hijack ships, kidnap crew members, and demand ransom payments. They use local fishing boats and insider knowledge from port workers. And unlike Somali pirates, they often take hostages ashore, vanishing into the swamps before any navy can react. The region now accounts for the majority of global kidnapping incidents at sea. High-tech buccaneers. Today's pirates may not use cutlasses, but they're no less inventive. They hack GPS systems, jam radios, and spoof AIS trackers, the digital beacons that ships use to identify themselves. They launch attacks from small skiffs guided by satellite coordinates. Some even use drones for scouting. In other words, piracy has entered the cyber age. And in a world where ships are increasingly automated, that's terrifying. Because why storm a deck when you can hijack a ship's navigation system from a laptop? Piracy on land, the corporate kind. Now, let's get a little philosophical. Because, ironically, while nations spend billions fighting piracy at sea, they often ignore the kind happening in boardrooms. When multinational companies strip resources from poor countries, or when foreign trawlers overfish local waters, isn't that a kind of piracy, too? That's exactly how the Somali fishermen saw it in the first place. They weren't wrong. The sea, as always, is just a mirror for the land. Modern mercenaries and private navies. Here's something fascinating. The end of Somali piracy didn't just stop crime. It created an industry. Private maritime security firms now guard everything from oil tankers to yachts. They operate floating armories, employ ex-Navy SEALs, and coordinate with insurance companies. Essentially, piracy gave birth to privatized defense. The line between protection and profit blurred, just like it did in the 1600s when governments hired privateers. History repeats, but this time the cannons are sponsored by corporations. The human ocean. Despite all this, the truth remains. Most people at sea aren't pirates or soldiers. They're workers. Over 1 million seafarers keep the global economy running, often in exhausting, dangerous conditions. Many come from poor nations, earning low wages to deliver the world's luxuries. They're the invisible labor behind the global dream. And they're also the ones who suffer most when piracy strikes. The sea has always been brutal that way, beautiful from afar, merciless up close. Why piracy persists? Here's the uncomfortable truth. You can't kill piracy with guns. Because piracy isn't just crime, it's symptom. It grows out of poverty, corruption, and chaos. Whenever a coastline is abandoned by law and opportunity, the ocean becomes a weapon. The pirates don't come from nowhere. They come from hunger. As long as the world's richest cargo passes by the world's poorest shores, piracy will find a way to rise again. The new face of the Jolly Roger. So yes, the pirate still lives. He doesn't drink rum or quote Shakespeare anymore. He wears a balaclava, drives a speedboat, and negotiates over satellite phone. But the essence hasn't changed. It's still about freedom and desperation, power and survival, the individual against the system. We may romanticize the 18th century and condemn the 21st, but in both, it's the same ocean, the same human hunger. And somewhere out there, in the moonlit dark, another small boat is racing toward a bigger one, driven by the same old mix of courage, greed, and fury. Because the black flag never truly came down. It just found new coordinates. Chapter 11. The Pirate Code, Myths, Morality, and the Rules of the Lawless. The phrase, the Pirate Code, gets thrown around a lot these days, usually by movie characters with too much eyeliner and not enough moral compass. But the funny thing is, it was real. Not in the swashbuckling, take what you can give nothing back sense, but in a surprisingly bureaucratic way. Yes, actual pirates, those dirty, half-starved, sunburned criminals, once sat down and wrote out rules. Rules about loot. Rules about conduct. Rules about how not to murder each other before lunch. Because even on the edge of civilization, it turns out you still need a little paperwork. The myth versus the minutes. Hollywood likes to pretend pirates were wild anarchists, men with no laws, no loyalties, just a life of reckless adventure and convenient explosions. In reality, they were more like floating communes with a severe disciplinary streak. They didn't reject order. They rejected other people's order. So, when they created their own, it was meticulous and deeply democratic. Pirate codes, sometimes called articles, were written agreements every crew member had to sign, or make an X on, depending on literacy levels. They outlined everything from the division of spoils to how disputes would be settled. Basically, they were HR policies. If HR carried cutlasses and drank rum for breakfast. Origins of the articles. The idea came from privateers, those state-sanctioned pirates we met earlier. Privateer ships often had contracts regulating how captured goods would be split among the crew. When piracy went freelance, the system came along for the ride. But without governments breathing down their necks, pirates expanded the concept. They added clauses about discipline, injury compensation, and even vacation time, if you could call not dying vacation. Each ship's code was unique, but most followed similar principles. Let's drift through some of the famous ones. Black Bart's Articles, the HR Manual of Doom. Bartholomew Black Bart Roberts, the dashing Welshman who terrorized the Atlantic in the early 1700s, had one of the most detailed codes on record. It was written down by one of his captured crew, and it reads like something between a worker's charter and a middle school rulebook. For example, no gambling aboard the ship. Apparently, risking your life daily wasn't thrilling enough. Lights out at 8 o'clock. After that, anyone who wanted to keep drinking had to do it quietly on deck. Equal share of plunder for everyone. Except, of course, for the captain and officers, who got a slightly larger cut, but still far less than what Navy captains made. No bringing women or boys aboard. A rule probably broken as often as it was enforced, but theoretically meant to avoid jealousy and chaos. Compensation for injury. Lose a limb? You got a payout. For example, a lost right arm was worth 600 pieces of 8, roughly equivalent to several years of honest wages. It was rough justice, but justice nonetheless. Pirate democracy, the floating republics. One of the most fascinating parts of pirate life was how democratic it was, especially compared to the societies they came from. In the 18th century, sailors in the Royal Navy lived under brutal hierarchies. They could be flogged, starved, or executed for disobedience. They earned next to nothing while officers lived comfortably. Pirate crews flipped that script. Captains were elected. Yes, elected. If the crew didn't like how you handled a battle, they could vote you out. Decisions like when to fight, where to sail, or how to divide loot were often made collectively. Major disputes went to a council. So, in a strange twist, these supposed villains were practicing one of the purest forms of democracy on Earth, long before revolutions made it fashionable. They were, in their own grimy way, proto-republicans of the sea. The quartermaster, the balance of power. Every pirate ship had an unsung hero, or tyrant, depending on perspective the quartermaster. He was the second in command, chosen by the crew, and served as a check on the captain's authority. If the captain was the face of leadership, the quartermaster was the voice of the people. He distributed loot, handled punishments, and could even overrule the captain in matters of fairness. Think of him as a union boss with a pistol. This power balance prevented mutiny, or at least delayed it. Everyone had a say, and greed was kept somewhat in check. Ironically, these brutal criminals created a system more equitable than most governments of their time. Discipline on the high seas. Now, you might assume pirates were constantly drunk, fighting, and singing sea shanties, and, well, yes, they did all that. But they also had surprisingly strict discipline. Stealing from another crewmate could get you marooned, left alone on a desert island with nothing but a bottle of water and your regrets. Cowardice in battle was punishable by death. Betrayal was the ultimate sin. And if you were caught cheating the crew out of treasure, you might find yourself dancing from the yardarm before dinner. So yes, they lived free, but only within the boundaries they collectively agreed upon. Outside of that, freedom ended with a rope. The morality of thieves. The pirate code wasn't about ethics in a modern sense. It wasn't about good or evil, it was about survival. But it still created a kind of moral logic. They might rob merchants, but they wouldn't rob each other. They might kill enemies, but not without cause. They might defy kings, but not their own rules. It was the morality of the marginalized, those who had been used, discarded, and left to rot by the empires they served. For many sailors, piracy wasn't rebellion. It was revenge dressed as freedom. Pirate justice, brutal but equal. When disputes arose, pirates held trials, often informal, but with witnesses and votes. If two crewmen fought, the code sometimes allowed for duels with pistols or swords, though more often it ended with a few bruises and some name-calling. Serious crimes, like theft or murder, could lead to execution, usually by hanging, shooting, or marooning. But there was one rule every pirate understood instinctively: the punishment had to fit the crime. That sense of proportion, strange as it seems, made piracy a kind of self-contained micro-society, fairer to its members than any empire's navy. Pay and perks. Let's talk money, the real reason most pirates signed up. Unlike navy sailors, pirates actually got paid. Loot was divided according to a set formula. The captain received 2 shares. The quartermaster got 1.5. Ordinary seamen received 1 share each. And before anyone touched their gold, deductions were made for the injured, the pirate version of workers' comp. So yes, pirates practiced profit sharing. They even kept a communal fund for ship repairs and medical supplies, a floating welfare system. Honestly, if you ignore the occasional beheading, it was practically socialist. Women and the code. Of course, not all pirates were men, though the rules didn't always know what to do with that. And Bonnie and Mary Red famously broke those boundaries, but their ships still followed codes forbidding women aboard. The contradiction was immense. In theory, the rule was meant to prevent jealousy or distraction. In practice, women who disguised themselves well enough were accepted, as long as they fought and shared like everyone else. Equality through anonymity, you might say. The code is myth. By the time writers got hold of these stories, the pirate code had turned into legend, an unwritten honor system of rogues with hearts of gold. In truth, it was far less romantic. It was about rationing rum, preventing theft, and avoiding chaos in a society without prisons. But because the real thing was so pragmatic, it fascinated people even more. It showed that even in a world of outlaws, order was inevitable. Humans can't help themselves, give us anarchy, and we'll immediately start forming committees. The paradox of freedom. And maybe that's why pirates still intrigue us. They represented absolute freedom, but also the price of it. To live outside the law, they had to invent their own. The ocean is vast, but you can't live on it without a compass. And every ship, no matter how rebellious, needs rules to keep it from sinking. So, in the end, the pirate code wasn't hypocrisy. It was survival disguised as principle. A floating democracy of thieves, proving that even criminals crave justice, as long as it's their version of it. The legacy of the code. Believe it or not, historians trace some modern democratic ideas back to these sea-bound republics. The idea that leaders can be elected and removed by common consent? Pirates did it first. Equal distribution of wealth among workers? Pirates again written constitutions? You guessed it, pirates had them long before colonies drafted theirs. Of course, it's a stretch to say they inspired democracy directly, but the parallels are uncanny. They were the unwanted reflections of the societies that birthed them, rough, loud, and unashamedly human. Closing thoughts. So, next time you hear the phrase, pirate code, don't think of cursed treasure or ghost ships. Think of a cramped deck in the Caribbean sun, men and women sitting in a circle, arguing about fairness and pay. They weren't noble. They weren't good. But they were fair in their own way. They built a tiny world where the powerless made the rules, and somehow, that world still echoes in ours. Chapter 12. The End of the Golden Age. How empires finally crushed the pirates. By the 1720s, the oceans were slowly closing in on pirates. The Golden Age, once roaring with gunpowder, rum, and lawless freedom, was fading like a sunset over the horizon. No one moment ended it, no grand battle, no spectacular duel. It was quieter than that. The world simply became too organized for chaos to survive. The growing strength of empires. The late 17th and early 18th centuries saw European empires consolidating power. Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands had massive colonial holdings, growing navies, and increasingly complex trade networks. They couldn't afford to have a few thousand men in tricorn hats disrupting everything. Navies expanded dramatically. Ships that once transported luxury goods now carried cannon after cannon, patrolling the coasts and escorting merchant convoys. It wasn't just brute force. It was also strategy. Convoys, safe harbors, and the cooperation of local colonial governors created a web of control that pirates couldn't pierce. Even the old pirate havens, Nassau in the Bahamas, Port Royal in Jamaica, Tortuga in Haiti, fell under strict imperial oversight. Safe spaces for freedom were becoming museums, or worse, military outposts. Blackbeard and the End of Fear. The infamous Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, met his end in 1718. By then, his career had already grown legendary. Ships surrendered at the mere mention of his name. His beard was rumored to be lit with slow-burning fuses during battle to terrify enemies, which, unsurprisingly, made him look like a demonic fireworks display. But the world had changed. A naval officer named Lieutenant Robert Maynard cornered Blackbeard off Ocracoke Island. The ensuing fight was brutal, but precise. Teach died, and with him went one of the last figures capable of holding the oceans in fear. His death wasn't just about one man. It signaled that no pirate, no matter how charismatic, brutal, or clever, could withstand the systematic power of a state. Trials and hangings. Captured pirates were often tried in public courts, their fate designed as much for spectacle as for justice. Hanging was the standard sentence, often at places called execution dock or along the Thames. Bodies were displayed in gibbets over water, swaying in the wind as warnings to sailors and would-be outlaws. It was grim theater. Crowds would gather, sometimes thousands of people, to watch. Some pirates were as young as teenagers, others grizzled veterans of countless battles. It didn't matter, the message was clear. The sea no longer belonged to those who wanted it. And yet, in the irony of it all, many pirates had begun as privateers, sanctioned by the very governments now executing them. Loyalty had a short shelf life. Amnesties and surrenders. Not all pirates met violent ends. Governments, realizing that constant hunting was costly, began offering pardons. The British Crown, for instance, issued general amnesties, essentially saying, "Surrender, and we might pretend none of this ever happened." Many pirates took the offer. Some returned to ordinary lives, taking jobs on merchant ships, or quietly settling in port towns with the gold they had hidden. But freedom came with a cost. The romantic vision of boundless adventure was replaced by taxes, regulations, and, ironically, paperwork. Even legends like Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, who once sailed in style and suffered through absurdly incompetent adventures, ended up executed despite his charm and wealth. The lesson was clear: the Golden Age wasn't negotiable. Economics and the end of the free sea. Another quiet killer of piracy was economic. Trade had grown too important to leave it to chance. Merchants insured ships. Convoys minimized risk. Navies protected routes. Where pirates once thrived on chaos and surprise, they now faced careful planning, intelligence networks, and a constant naval presence. The sea, once a wild playground, became a ledger. Freedom couldn't compete with accounting, and those who tried to resist were eliminated or absorbed into the system. The last strongholds. Even after the hangings, the surrenders, and the economic crackdown, a few holdouts remained. The Bahamas, Madagascar, and some Caribbean hideouts still hosted small crews. But these were shadows of what had been. Pirates were no longer shaping history, they were reacting to it. They were survivors, scavenging the scraps left by empires and commerce. By the mid-1720s, the Golden Age was effectively over. The ocean remained vast and mysterious, but it had been colonized, measured, and surveilled. The quiet irony. It's almost poetic. Pirates had spent decades defying governments, empires, and the law. But in the end, it wasn't a grand battle or moral failing that ended them. It was bureaucracy, coordination, and the relentless expansion of trade. Freedom had been strangled not by swords, but by schedules, taxes, and ledgers. The very empires pirates had railed against became the instruments of their demise. And the irony doesn't stop there. These same empires would later romanticize the pirates they had executed, turning them into symbols of rebellion for generations to come. Lessons in decline. The end of piracy teaches us something subtle. Rebellion can thrive in chaos, but it struggles against organization. The pirates weren't weak. They were brilliant, adaptable, and terrifying to their enemies. But the world caught up. Naval officers, accountants, merchants, and bureaucrats combined forces in a slow, relentless siege that the bravest pirate could not withstand. The sea remained, but the rules had changed. Where once the black flag waved freely, the colors of empire now dominated. The legacy of the Golden Age. Even as it ended, the Golden Age left its mark. It shaped literature and myth. It inspired new ideas about democracy and fairness among outlaws. It created archetypes of freedom, defiance, and charisma that persist in culture today. And the irony remains. Pirates, once hanged and forgotten, became immortal in stories, films, and imaginations. The hangings silenced their voices, but the myths gave them a new one. In a way, that's the last great trick of the Golden Age. Pirates didn't disappear. They simply became eternal, not in fact, but in legend. Chapter 13. Pirates in Popular Culture, from Treasure Island to Jack Sparrow. By the mid-18th century, the Golden Age of piracy was officially over. The seas were controlled, the hangings were publicized, and pirate crews dwindled into history books or coastal folklore. And yet, oddly enough, that's exactly when the real immortality of pirates began. Because while the criminals themselves had been executed, imprisoned, or forced to return to dull civilian life, the idea of piracy refused to die. It leapt from the high seas into the printed page, and from there, it never looked back. The pamphlet explosion. Almost immediately after the last pirate hangings, printers realized something important. People loved stories about criminals. Pamphlets and broadsheets sold like hotcakes, true confessions, eyewitness accounts, and sensationalized retellings of pirate exploits. They were often exaggerated, sometimes completely fabricated, but they gave the public what it craved: adventure, danger, and moral outrage all bundled together. Titles like The 3 Voyages of Captain William Kidd and A General History of the Pirates became bestsellers. The latter, published in 1724 under the mysterious pseudonym Captain Charles Johnson, is considered the most influential pirate book ever. Johnson's accounts of Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Bonnie, and Bartholomew Roberts blended fact and fiction so seamlessly that it's often impossible to tell where history ends and legend begins. But that didn't matter. People didn't buy it for accuracy. They bought it for the thrill of rebellion, the allure of gold, and the fantasy of life untethered by law. From page to stage. Pirates weren't content to stay on paper. By the 18th and 19th centuries, theatrical productions began to feature swashbuckling pirates. The stage versions were melodramatic, full of romantic duels, daring escapes, and, of course, lots of shouting "avast." They were already cleaning up the image. Pirates were no longer filthy, disease-ridden thieves. Instead, they became charming, clever, and sometimes even noble, albeit with a fondness for plunder. The public loved it. The pirate as entertainment was born. Stevenson and Treasure Island. In 1883, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island, and everything changed. He codified the pirate archetype we recognize today. Peg-legged men. Eye patches. Parrots on shoulders. Maps marked with X. Cunning but oddly charismatic villains. Long John Silver, with his mix of charm, treachery, and paternal affection for Jim Hawkins, became the template for every pirate in fiction that followed. Stevenson didn't just tell a story, he invented a myth. He turned pirates from historical criminals into universal symbols of adventure, risk, and moral ambiguity. Suddenly, being a pirate didn't just mean stealing. It meant defiance, cleverness, and living outside the rules, a kind of high-seas existentialism. Pirates in art. The Romantic painters of the 19th century embraced the pirate as a subject. Storm-lashed seas, dramatic sunsets, and towering masts filled their canvases. Pirates weren't just thieves, they were metaphors for freedom, danger, and the sublime. The visual language established by these paintings carried into film and animation. A pirate's ship was always on the horizon, ever on the move, forever tempting viewers with the unknown. The silver screen arrives. By the early 20th century, cinema picked up the baton. Silent films and early talkies like The Sea Hawk and Captain Blood established the swashbuckler as a cinematic staple. Actors like Douglas Fairbanks and later Errol Flynn embodied pirates as heroes rather than criminals. The narrative became formulaic but irresistible. Pirates fight for freedom. Pirates duel for honor. Pirates find love or treasure. Pirates, of course, look impeccable doing all of it. The historical realities, disease, short life expectancy, terrible hygiene, were quietly swept under the deck planks. Disney and the family-friendly pirate. Disney, perhaps more than any other company, cemented the sanitized, fun-loving pirate in the global imagination. From the 1950 animated adaptation of Treasure Island to the famous Pirates of the Caribbean ride in 1967, pirates were transformed into entertainment icons. They could be funny, clever, and spooky, but never genuinely threatening. Rum was optional. Death was optional. Adventure was mandatory. By this point, pirates were no longer criminals. They were a brand. Jack Sparrow and the modern myth. Then came Johnny Depp in 2003. The Pirates of the Caribbean movies introduced the world to Jack Sparrow, a pirate entirely divorced from historical reality. He was cunning, flamboyant, absurd, and strangely endearing. He survived storms, curses, and betrayals with a swagger no historical pirate could afford. He wasn't a villain, but he wasn't a hero either. He was chaos personified, perfectly tuned to modern taste. And once again, audiences couldn't get enough. The myth had been refreshed for a new generation. The pirate today, memes, merch, and culture. Pirates no longer require ships. They appear in video games, memes, Halloween costumes, and every form of merchandise imaginable. Talk Like a Pirate Day has become an international holiday, celebrated by millions, and yet it is harmless, absurd, and joyous. Even in the digital age, piracy thrives, albeit in different forms. Intellectual property theft, software piracy, and streaming services. It's ironic, really. The pirates of the 21st century are often invisible, but no less cunning. Why the myth endures? The real pirates were terrifying, disease-ridden, short-lived, and ultimately doomed. The fictional pirates? Immortal. Why do we continue to love them? They embody freedom, a life untethered by rules. They test the boundaries of morality. They offer adventure without consequence. They symbolize rebellion, cleverness, and charisma. We've sanitized them, romanticized them, and merchandised them, but underneath all the parrot imagery and Hollywood glamour lies the same core idea. Humans will always love a figure who challenges authority, dances with danger, and lives entirely on their own terms. The comfort of the myth. Pirates allow us to flirt with chaos safely. We can watch them from a screen, read about them in a book, or wear a costume for fun. We can enjoy the rebellion, the freedom, the adventure, without ever risking scurvy, sunburn, or the gallows. And in that way, the myth has become even more enduring than the reality. The Golden Age may have ended in hangings and defeat, but the pirate lives on, eternal, glamorous, and delightfully lawless. Chapter 14. Women of the Golden Age, and Bonnie, Mary Read, and the Forgotten Heroines. Piracy, as most people imagine it, is almost always men, rough, bearded, sunburned, and perpetually smelling of salt and rum. But like every historical narrative, that's incomplete. Women existed on the high seas, and some of them were as fearsome as any Blackbeard or Calico Jack. Their stories are rarer, harder to trace, and often clouded by rumor and gossip, but when they appear, they are extraordinary. Tonight, let's drift gently through the lives of a few remarkable women who dared to claim the freedom of the ocean for themselves. And Bonnie, the fiery Irishwoman. And Bonnie is perhaps the most famous female pirate of the Golden Age. Born around 1697 in Ireland, she moved to the Americas as a child. She grew up in the Carolinas, and by all accounts, she was spirited, independent, and prone to rebellion, traits that would serve her well on the open sea. She married a small-time pirate named James Bonny, but reportedly found him dull and cowardly. Legend says she left him to join the crew of Calico Jack Rackham, disguising herself as a man to blend in, which, in itself, is a quietly radical statement. If society won't give you freedom, take it yourself. And quickly became known for her courage. She was reputedly temperamental, violent when angered, and ready to fight at a moment's notice. Her presence alone reportedly inspired fear, partly because men never expected a woman to be a threat. Mary Read, the disguised Englishwoman. Mary Read's story is just as compelling. Born in England around 1685, she spent her early life dressed as a boy, a practical decision to survive and earn wages in a society that limited opportunities for women. She eventually found herself on the Caribbean seas, serving as a sailor and later joining pirate crews, often still disguised as a man. Mary was said to be physically strong, courageous in combat, and fiercely loyal to her crew. She met Bonny on Calico Jack's ship. Accounts suggest they were close allies, if not friends, and perhaps more, though history is vague. Together, they challenged the gender norms of the day, commanding attention and fear in equal measure. Life on board. Despite the romanticized images, life aboard pirate ships was harsh for everyone, and doubly so for women. And Mary had to hide their identities at times, not because pirates disapproved, they often admired boldness, but because the world outside was unforgiving. Being discovered by authorities or rival crews could mean immediate execution. Yet both women thrived in this brutal microcosm. They fought, took shares of plunder, and in the case of and even reportedly participated in battle alongside men. Their very presence upended expectations that women were delicate, passive, or confined to the home. Calico Jack and the female companions. Calico Jack Rackham himself is often remembered only because of his two famous female crewmates. He was not especially successful as a pirate. He preferred flamboyance to strategy and charm over discipline. But Bonny and Mary Read gave his reputation a curious edge. Some accounts suggest that the crew was unusually loyal to him, or perhaps to the combined fearsome force of the two women and the captain. Either way, the trio became iconic. In 1720, their luck ran out. The ship was caught by a British naval vessel. Most of the crew were captured, including Anne and Mary. Trials and the end. The women's stories diverge at this point. Both Bonny and Mary Read were sentenced to hang, a grim fate in line with the rest of the captured pirates. However, both claimed to be pregnant. In legal terms, pregnancy delayed execution, a mercy, or a bureaucratic loophole, depending on how you look at it. Mary Read reportedly died in prison from fever before her sentence could be carried out. And Bonny's fate is less clear. Some accounts suggest she escaped, married, or simply faded from the historical record. The ambiguity has only enhanced her legend. She became the eternal symbol of daring and defiance, a woman who refused the limits of her world. Other women on the margins. Of course, Bonny and Read were not alone. There were other women who took to the seas, often disguised as men or hiding among crews. Some served as captains, others as lieutenants, and some simply survived in harsh conditions where most men would falter. Their lives are harder to trace because chroniclers, almost all men, often ignored or sensationalized them. Female pirates were considered oddities, curiosities, or moral lessons rather than subjects of serious history. Yet when we piece together these fragmented stories, a pattern emerges. These women were bold, capable, and willing to challenge a world built to suppress them. Why these stories matter? the tales of Bonnie and Mary Read remind us of something subtle but important. History is never complete. For every famous male pirate, there were likely dozens of women operating in the shadows, unrecorded, forgotten, or erased. They existed at the margins, proving that even in the harshest, most male-dominated environments, human ingenuity and courage can flourish. And in a gentle, ironic twist, it's often these women who capture our imagination today. Perhaps because their rebellion was twofold, against law and against gender expectations. The legacy of female pirates. Today, Bonnie and Mary Read symbolize more than swashbuckling adventure. They represent defiance against rigid social norms. They remind us that courage is not gendered. They show that freedom, even temporary, fleeting, or dangerous, was worth pursuing in the harshest conditions imaginable. Historians may never know exactly what became of Bonnie. Mary Read's life ended in confinement, but her story survives in myth. And that's the point. Pirate legends, especially those of women, are measured not by longevity but by audacity. Quiet reflections. It's tempting to imagine these women in full pirate regalia, sword in hand, storms raging around them. But the real drama lies in subtler moments. A young woman stepping onto a ship deck, disguised as a man, knowing discovery could mean death. Facing a life of hunger, disease, and violence with determination. Demanding equal shares, respect, and autonomy in a world that gave her none. In a quiet, reflective sense, that's far more terrifying and inspiring than any cannon blast. The golden age of piracy wasn't only about men swinging from rigging or burying treasure. It was also about women who carved space for themselves in a world determined to erase them. And maybe, just maybe, that is the truest form of piracy. Defiance, survival, and the courage to be remembered. Chapter 15. Pirate ships and daily life, how they survived, barely, on the open sea. By now, we've floated through legends, codes, and the occasional extraordinary pirate woman. But life at sea was not all drama and treasure maps. In reality, it was cramped, filthy, and exhausting, the kind of life that makes you reconsider romantic notions of piracy. Let's drift gently into the practicalities, the ships, the food, the routines, and the barely tolerable conditions that defined daily life for a pirate. The ships they called home. Pirates didn't have giant floating fortresses. Most ships were stolen or captured merchant vessels, sometimes small sloops or schooners that prioritized speed over comfort. The design of these ships meant that everything happened in tight quarters. Below deck, it was dark, damp, and suffocating. Hammocks were often shared or strung above barrels of supplies. Privacy was non-existent, and noise, from the creaking hull, the clanging of rigging, or the snoring of crew members, never stopped. Yet pirates managed these spaces efficiently. Every inch was used for cargo, weapon storage, or provisions. Even living quarters were often convertible. Bunks might become storage, storage might become workspaces. It was a constant negotiation between survival and comfort. Food, mostly not good. Pirates ate to survive, not to enjoy. Their diet relied heavily on hardtack, a kind of rock-hard biscuit made from flour and water. It could last months, but required a hammer or patience to chew. Salted meat, when available, was usually tough, rancid, and crawling with worms. Vegetables were rare, meaning scurvy, the disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a constant threat. Fresh water was precious. Pirates sometimes drank beer or rum to avoid contaminated water, though that often led to drunken mishaps and morale issues. Meals were functional, not social. Pirates might joke, barter, or fight over food, but dining was survival, not pleasure. Hygiene, or the lack thereof. If you imagine pirates scrubbing decks and bathing regularly, let's stop right there. Hygiene was minimal. Sea salt, sweat, and decay combined to create an odor that modern noses would likely find unbearable. Lice, fleas, and scurvy-ridden gums were common companions. Washing was occasional at best, often limited to rainwater or brief stops on shore. Yet somehow, pirates managed to survive. Their resilience was astonishing, not heroic in a cinematic sense, but quietly grim, the kind that gets you through months of cramped, disease-ridden living. Work and routine. Life on a pirate ship was not idly spent swinging cutlasses. There was constant labor, repairing sails and rigging, loading and unloading cargo, maintaining cannons and firearms, cleaning the deck, standing watch. Even sleep was structured. Pirates worked in shifts, often called watches, ensuring that the ship was manned 24 hours a day. Pirate life demanded cooperation, skill, and constant vigilance. Any lapse could mean capsizing, capture, or death. Weapons and combat preparedness. Unlike Hollywood portrayals, pirates didn't spend all their time dueling with swords. Weapons were tools of survival. Cutlasses, pistols, and muskets were maintained carefully, and training was constant. Pirates practiced boarding techniques, defensive maneuvers, and damage control. Yet space was limited. Weapons had to be stored safely, often in shared lockers, and ammunition was rationed. Combat was rarely glamorous. It was chaotic, messy, and terrifying. Navigation and weather. Without GPS or radar, pirates relied on charts, compasses, and celestial navigation. Experienced captains memorized trade winds, currents, and seasonal storms. A miscalculation could strand a ship for weeks or drive it onto reefs. Weather dictated schedules and strategies. Calm seas were boring but necessary for repairs. Storms were life-threatening but sometimes offered cover from naval patrols. Life at sea was a constant negotiation with the environment, demanding patience, skill, and a tolerance for monotony punctuated by sudden terror. Disease and mortality. Pirates were acutely aware of death. Scurvy, dysentery, and infections were rampant. A minor wound could become fatal without proper care. Funerals at sea were often simple, bodies wrapped and dropped overboard, sometimes with a plank for dignity, often without. Life expectancy was short. Many pirates were dead before they reached 40. Those who survived did so through luck, cunning, and sheer physical resilience. The community of the ship. Despite the harshness, pirate ships developed social structures. Crews formed tight-knit groups, bound by necessity, fear, and loyalty. Disputes were common, but so were camaraderie and shared meals when possible. The quartermaster and captain maintained order, while the code created expectations and limits. It was a delicate balance, the difference between a functioning crew and mutiny. Entertainment and leisure. Even amid hardship, pirates found small ways to pass the time. Singing in sea shanties to coordinate labor or ease boredom. Gambling with cards or dice. Storytelling, often exaggerated or frightening. Drinking rum, occasionally medicinal, occasionally recreational. Entertainment was brief, simple, and often risky. A wrong bet or insult could escalate into violence. Yet it provided morale and cohesion, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, humans need diversion. Pirates' survival skills. Survival depended on resourcefulness. Fishing and foraging during stops. Repairing sails and hulls with improvised materials. Navigating using stars and currents. Treating injuries with rudimentary medicine. The very act of existing at sea was a testament to resilience. Pirates lived on the knife edge of disaster daily, and yet, somehow, they endured. The quiet reality. The romantic images of pirates swinging from ropes, laughing as cannons roar, or striking gold are, in truth, simplifications. The real pirate life was crowded, dirty, dangerous, exhilarating only in bursts, always on the edge of starvation, disease, or capture. And yet, for all its misery, pirates thrived in this environment. They were adaptable, clever, and surprisingly organized. Perhaps that's why the myth endures, because the reality, while harsh, was also awe-inspiring. The pirate ship was more than a vessel, it was a microcosm of society. A place of danger, democracy, defiance, and survival, all pressed together on a rolling, unpredictable stage. The Golden Age may have ended with hangings and empire, but aboard those vessels, life, harsh, chaotic, and raw, persisted in ways that history and myth could not fully erase. Chapter 16. Pirates' Treasure, Truth, Myth, and the Obsession with Gold. When most people think of pirates, the image that springs to mind is immediate: a chest overflowing with gold doubloons, glittering jewels, and maps marked with a bright, ominous X. It's an image repeated endlessly in stories, films, and games, but the reality was, as usual, far less glamorous. Let's gently explore the truth behind pirate treasure, the myths that grew around it, and why the obsession with gold became such a lasting part of the pirate legend. The reality of loot. Pirates were thieves, and thieves are practical. Gold and silver were valuable, yes, but most pirate plunder came from whatever could be carried, sold, or traded quickly. Food, rum, and weapons often ranked higher than coins. Cloth, sails, and ship supplies could be sold in port for cash. Valuable cargo wasn't always treasure. Spices, sugar, and tobacco were common targets. When pirates captured a ship, the process was systematic. Crew members would inventory goods, store what they could use, and prepare the rest for sale. The chest full of gold in the captain's cabin was often more symbolic than real. Even the shares of loot distributed according to the pirate code were usually practical, a mixture of currency, commodities, and occasionally trinkets that seemed valuable to the untrained eye. Buried treasure, the greatest myth. Perhaps the most persistent myth is the idea of buried treasure. Stories of pirates hiding gold in remote islands, then leaving cryptic maps, are largely fictional. Few documented cases exist, and most involve either staged stories by pirates themselves or exaggerations by later authors. Why does the idea persist? It's cinematic. It's romantic. It transforms piracy into a puzzle, a quest, a moral adventure rather than mere theft. In truth, pirates preferred to spend, trade, or convert treasure immediately. Gold that sat idle could attract unwanted attention, spoil morale, or risk capture by authorities. Even the infamous Captain Kidd, often blamed for a treasure hoard, buried little, and much of what he did hide was recovered quickly or lost to history. Treasure as status and security. While buried caches were rare, treasure did have psychological and social significance. Pirates used gold and valuables to reward loyalty, maintain morale, demonstrate rank, secure personal freedom. The pirate who flaunted wealth subtly reminded the crew, "I am skilled, successful, and capable of providing for us all." But practicality always came first. Hoarding could be dangerous or inefficient. The literary amplification. Books like A General History of the Pirates, 1724, amplified the treasure myth exponentially. Johnson's accounts sensationalized hoards, hidden chests, and mysterious islands. Even if he couldn't verify details, the stories sold copies. Readers imagined treasure beyond imagination, fueling dreams of gold and adventure that reality rarely fulfilled. Subsequent authors, dramatizations, and stage adaptations built on this foundation. The idea of treasure became more important than its reality. A chest of gold symbolized freedom, defiance, and the ultimate reward for risk, far more compelling than the mundane reality of plundered sugar or barrels of rum. Treasure hunting, an obsession. The myth of buried treasure inspired centuries of searching. Adventurers, historians, and hobbyists scoured islands, coastlines, and old ports for pirate gold. Some found coins or small caches, but the large, legendary hoards remained elusive. The obsession persists today. Metal detectors, maps, and digital recreations continue to fuel the dream of hidden wealth. It's a testament to the power of myth. The stories create longing, curiosity, and hope even centuries after the Golden Age ended. Treasure beyond gold. Ironically, for pirates themselves, treasure wasn't always about coins or jewels. Loyalty and survival were forms of wealth. Knowledge of safe harbors, currents, and trade routes was valuable. Reputation, a pirate feared or respected, functioned as social capital. Rum, food, and medicine were treasured more than luxuries at times. This broader definition of treasure reflects a subtle truth. Survival on the open seas was itself a kind of wealth. Modern interpretations. Hollywood, video games, and novels continue to focus on treasure, often at the expense of reality. Pirates are portrayed with chests, gems, and gold-laden beaches. Maps and cryptic riddles dominate narratives. The idea of a solitary, cunning pirate outsmarting everyone to find hidden gold enthralls audiences. Yet these tales, while fanciful, capture the essence of piracy: risk, strategy, defiance, and the dream of ultimate freedom. In a way, the treasure myth has become the pirate's real legacy. It's the part of the story we can still grasp, the glittering, tantalizing symbol of a life lived outside the law.